In 1992, in a small town in Michigan, a woman decided to go for a walk in the woods with her 5 dogs. So she and her animals left the house she was staying in and marched across the backyard into the nearby forest, and they began walking. A few hours later, one of those 5 dogs suddenly came bounding out of the forest back towards the house all by itself. When the woman's family noticed the animal, they knew something was wrong, so they rushed into the woods to see what was going on. What they would find out there was horrific, and it would become one of the most sensational crime stories to ever come out of Michigan's remote and mysterious Upper Peninsula. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week. Once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to house sit for the Amazon Music follow button, but when you get there, just prop all of their doors and windows open and then leave. Okay, let's get into today's story. "35-year-old Judy Moylanen checked one more time that her 3-year-old daughter was safely buckled into her car seat, and then, with a sigh of relief, Judy climbed into the passenger seat of the van and nodded to her husband Bruce, who was at the wheel, letting him know that they were now ready to go. The car engine was already on, and the inside of the vehicle was nice and warm, and in another minute, they had backed down the driveway of the neat brick ranch house directly onto US Route 41. It was Thanksgiving Day, November 26, 1992, and even now, hours before they would sit down to the traditional turkey dinner and prayer of gratitude, Judy was already feeling a little unaccustomed rush of happiness as she and Bruce headed west along 41 towards Judy's parents' house where they would spend the holiday weekend. Just 2 days ago, Judy had wondered if this trip would even be possible. Here, in Michigan's remote Upper Peninsula, Thanksgiving is almost overshadowed by the state's 2-week-long deer hunting season that spans the last 2 weeks of November. It's a time when the biggest fashion trend is blaze orange, and even visitors to the little town of Harvey, where the Moylanens lived, were more likely to ask each other, "Did you get your buck yet?" than they were to just wave and say hello. And on the first day of hunting season, Bruce had managed to bring home a male deer with a good-sized rack of antlers. But on the drive back to their house, after he was finished hunting, Bruce had hit another deer that was crossing the road, and that collision had totaled the Moylanens' Subaru station wagon. And it wasn't until the day just before Thanksgiving that the couple had been able to find and place a down payment on a replacement vehicle large enough to carry all of their luggage, as well as their 4 dogs. Unlike Judy's job as an assistant hospital administrator at nearby Marquette General Hospital, Bruce's side gig as a dog trainer meant that the family required a car that could accommodate several dog crates as well as 3 passengers. And the tan Chevrolet van was definitely comfortable as well as roomy. Within just a few minutes of starting their 2.5-hour drive, Elise had already dropped off to sleep. And with Bruce focused on how their new vehicle handled, Judy had a rare opportunity to just sit there and let her mind wander. Day to day, Judy's work was very demanding and she put in long hours. Even coupled with his dog training business and freelance work as an insurance claim adjuster, Bruce's main job as an instrument technician for Marquette General Hospital did not bring in as much money as Judy's regular paycheck. Not that Judy looked or acted the part of the traditional family breadwinner. Compared to her husband, who was 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered, and 180 pounds, Judy was just 5 foot 4 inches tall, with short, curly, light brown hair, and a quiet but practical manner. But behind Judy's oversized glasses, her eyes sparkled when she smiled. And she smiled a lot, just as she was quick to laugh at other people's jokes. And although Judy never sought out the social spotlight, in fact, that kind of attention would have just made her feel uncomfortable, her ability to listen and respond in ways that made others around her shine meant that people just really loved Judy and liked being around her. And there had always been more to Judy than met the eye. She adored her parents and her two brothers, and she was looking forward to spending the upcoming weekend chatting comfortably inside the snug family home with her mom and sister-in-law while Elise played with her cousins. But, like her younger brothers, Judy was also an outdoors person. Ever since she could walk, the woods in the back of her parents' home had been Judy's playground. And growing up in Ontonagon, with a population of just 2,000 people and a business district that did not have one single stoplight, there had been plenty of woods as well as fields and streams to explore. And so during that time, Judy had become very comfortable outdoors. She had also become skilled at handling firearms. So, in addition to enjoying plenty of time in the kitchen and in front of the fireplace, Judy was also looking forward to getting out in the forest with Bruce and her dad and brothers to do some hunting of their own. Hunting wasn't the only outdoor sport that Judy was really good at. She was also an excellent skier. In fact, it was that passion that had brought her and Bruce together back in 1974 when Judy was 17 and Bruce, who lived in a town even smaller than Ontonagon, was 20. But good as Judy was on skis, Bruce was even better. And at Porcupine Mountain, located right on the edge of Lake Superior, Bruce's ability and job with the ski patrol conferred a lot of status on a young man whose mother had barely scraped up the money to put food on the table for their 4 children, and whose father spent a lot of time at the local bars. So, at first glance, Judy and Bruce had been an unlikely couple. Overcoming his difficult childhood, Bruce had grown into a cocky and outgoing young man who never hesitated to speak his mind. Judy, on the other hand, came from a deeply religious, deeply conservative family whose morals and religious beliefs she shared. Her parents, Dale and Marianne Blake, had been high school sweethearts whose first child, Judy, had been born when Marianne was 21. Together, and for the last 40 years, the Blakes had owned and operated their own small automobile and oil business called Dale's Service. And as the Blake family grew with the arrival of Judy's 2 brothers, Marianne had supplemented their income with her job at First National Bank in Ontonagon, and then with the job she held now at Lake Superior Credit Union. But when it came to Judy's social life, even without her parents' tendency to be overprotective of their only daughter, Judy herself preferred reading and arts and crafts to parties and dating. Just as she would have chosen a good piece of pie and a cold glass of milk over a bottle of beer and a bowl of peanuts. But when Judy and Bruce both wound up attending Northern Michigan University in Marquette at the same time, the attraction between them was irresistible. And on June 24th, 1978, 4 years after meeting on the slopes of Porcupine Mountain, Bruce and Judy were married. Afterward, the couple stayed in Michigan's Upper Peninsula, but they moved 120 miles east to Harvey. Once there, Judy established her career at the nearby Marquette General Hospital. Bruce, who started out in healthcare as an emergency medical technician, eventually took the instrument technician job at Marquette General Hospital. Along the way, Bruce had established North County Claim Service, a small independent insurance business, and Big Creek Kennels. And 11 years after exchanging their wedding vows, the couple had added to the ranks of the Blake and Moylannon families with the birth of their first and so far only child, Elise, now napping soundly in the back seat of the 1987 Chevrolet van. Just the thought of her daughter always made Judy smile. And ever since Judy had suffered a serious concussion in a freak accident the year before, she had been reminded all over again about the importance of family and friends. She knew how happy her own parents would be to have their adult children, plus all 6 grandchildren, together under one roof for this holiday weekend. Not to mention the added excitement of 4 extra dogs, all Springer Spaniels, just like her parents' dog, Streak. But even as Judy looked forward to the Blake family reunion and good food that now lay just 2 hours ahead of them in a hometown that she had always loved, she could not entirely ignore that sense of dread that had become so familiar to her. And it was just not a feeling that she had been able to share with her family or with Bruce. He was handy around the house, great about taking care of Elise when Judy's workdays stretched to 12 hours, and he was also a better cook than she was. But discussing and exploring their innermost thoughts was not one of his strengths. Looking over at her husband now, his big familiar hands firmly on the wheel, Judy reminded herself that this was not the time to worry. This was the time for her and Bruce to relax, take stock of their lives and blessings, and spend time together over the long weekend. And sure enough, after Thursday's wonderful Thanksgiving celebration, Judy and Bruce were able to put in 2 full days of hunting together, while Elise enjoyed the attention of her grandmother and Mary Ann's own mother, Elise's great-grandmother Nimi. So on Friday, while Judy's brothers headed for their deer camp about 16 miles south, Bruce and Judy decided to try their luck at a hunting spot even further away. But at Dishnot Creek, their attempts to drive deer out of cover were unsuccessful, and so were the hours they spent sitting quietly in small camouflage shacks called blinds. So by late afternoon, Judy was ready to call it a day. The falling darkness and the sound of howling coyotes suddenly made her wish she was back at home instead of growing stiff with cold in these unfamiliar woods. But even as she stepped out of her blind to call out to Bruce, from behind her there was the sound of a gunshot. Down a small hill and across the creek in front of her, Bruce was so alarmed by the sudden noise he practically leapt out of his blind, hoping it was Judy who had fired at a deer. Instead, he saw his wife approaching through the dark, just carrying her flashlight, not her rifle. The shot had been so close to where Judy was standing that the whole episode shook both of them. It was a reminder of just how dangerous hunters could be, not just to the wildlife, but to other hunters. After that, Judy and Bruce abandoned their blinds and headed back to their van. The next morning, which was Saturday, the couple felt much better, and so Bruce and Judy did not need any persuading to go hunting again. But this time, they decided to go with other family members rather than striking out on their own again. Especially with hunting season about to close, everyone knew there were bound to be some hunters out in the woods who were going to be shooting at anything just to get that last buck. And by the time Judy woke up on Sunday morning, her only regret of the weekend was that her 4-day holiday was just hours from being over. She and Bruce had both come back empty-handed from hunting the day before, but better that, Judy thought, than just wounding a deer. That's what had happened to her cousin Mike, who had asked Bruce to get up early that morning and go back into the woods to see if they could find this wounded deer and put it out of its misery. As for Judy, while Bruce was out hunting, dropping in on some friends, and running errands before their return trip that evening back to Harvey, Judy was content to stay home with her sisters-in-law, her mom, and Grandma Nimi. After her mother had served up their traditional post-Thanksgiving lunch of turkey casserole, Judy was also glad to have the chance to give her mom a break. So, after everyone had finished eating, Judy urged her mother to take some time alone in her little office to relax and catch up on some bookkeeping for work, while Judy cleaned up and did the dishes. By about 1:15 p.m., Judy had the kitchen and dining room all squared away. Hanging the dish towel on its usual hook, Judy glanced at her watch and decided that now was a good time for her to take the 5 dogs out for their afternoon walk. Her younger brother, Jerry, and his family, who lived 4 hours away in Wisconsin, were planning to leave on Tanagan by 2:30, so Judy had just about an hour before she needed to be back with the dogs. As Judy pulled on her black down jacket, her parents' dog, Streak, was practically dancing with excitement at the signs that he was about to go outside. But it was the 4 much more obedient Moranan dogs kenneled outside who really needed the exercise. They were the ones with a long night of travel ahead. Judy didn't bother with a leash. This was 1992 and the Upper Peninsula, and dogs were free to run around. A few minutes later, Judy called out a goodbye to her mom and opened the door to step out into the thick woods just beyond the edge of her parents' backyard. As she did, she pulled her coat tighter around herself. Not only was it already below freezing outside, but the air was so damp it felt even colder, and the afternoon clouds completely blocked the sun. An hour later, at 2:15 p.m., Jerry and his wife had their car all packed and ready to go. The only thing they had left to do was to wait for Judy so they could say their final goodbyes before heading home. And that is when the Blakes looked out the back window of the kitchen and saw Streak come running out of the woods, tongue lolling and tail wagging. Except that Streak was all alone. Judy and the other 4 dogs were nowhere to be seen. By 4 p.m., Judy's mother knew there was something wrong. For the past hour and a half, Mary Ann had been telling herself that Streak, who was not nearly as well trained as Judy and Bruce's dogs, must have just decided it was time to go home. And Judy was probably still out in the woods thinking Streak was out there too, lost or just wandering around. But by 4:20, Mary Ann knew she was clutching at straws. There was just no way that Judy would stay out this long walking the dogs or looking for Streak, and no way she would have missed saying goodbye to Jerry and his family. So, with Bruce and Marianne's husband and her other son and his family all out of the house, Marianne decided to leave little Elise with her great-grandma Mimi and go find Judy herself. And minutes later, Marianne was at the door putting on her coat and boots, but Marianne's first attempt to find her daughter failed. In fact, when Marianne had blown the dog whistle she brought with her, the sight of the 4 dogs running in her direction and still no sign of Judy had only served to turn Marianne's sense of worry into outright fear. And by the time she had managed to get the dogs back in their kennels and return to the woods, Marianne was on the verge of tears. So she didn't hesitate when her neighbor, Bill Dorvanen, who had seen the older woman picking her way into the woods, offered to help with the search. And grabbing his flashlight, Bill now led the 2 of them deeper into the woods. It was about 5 p.m., and the sun was just 10 minutes away from setting when Bill saw Judy's body. Marianne's only daughter was right in front of them, lying across the trail on her left side, her eyes open and blank in the glare of the flashlight. Judy's head was resting on a slight rise, and her feet were partly submerged in a pool of icy water. When Bill carefully turned Judy over onto her back, her arms fell to either side, and a moment later, both Bill and behind him, Marianne, could see that Judy's upper right chest was completely soaked in dark red blood. It didn't take long for the local sheriff's deputy and emergency medical technicians who had responded to Bill's 911 call to confirm what Bill and a hysterical Marianne already knew, that Judy was dead. In fact, by the time those first responders had reached the scene at about 5:20 p.m., Judy's body was already showing signs of rigor mortis, a stiffening of her limbs that suggested Judy may have already been dead for as long as 3.5 hours. Before the medics removed Judy's body, Sheriff's Deputy Tom Cusino had done the best he could to gather any evidence of what might have happened to Judy. Even though it looked like a tragic hunting accident, law enforcement would still need to find out exactly what happened and who may have fired the stray bullet that had killed Judy. But even though the deputy had made sure to take plenty of pictures of Judy's body and the surrounding area, all he could really see were scattered leaves and dog prints. And he already knew from talking to the Blake's neighbor that one critical piece of evidence, the original position of the victim's body, had already been compromised when Bill had shifted Judy's body to check for signs of life. Now, after taking Marianne to stay with another neighbor, Bill had rejoined the deputy and told him everything that Marianne had said about why she was out in the woods looking for her daughter in the first place, how Judy's walk with the dogs had lasted far too long, and how Streak had come without Judy. In answer to the deputy's questions, Bill said no, this was not an area where people generally went hunting. It was too populated and too close to the 8 or 9 families, like the Blakes and Dorvanens, that lived right behind the woods on Cherry Lane. Then, together with one of the ambulance drivers, all 3 men used flashlights to search for any sign of the bullet or bullets that had nearly ripped Judy's body in half. It seemed likely that the shot had come from a rifle, a type of gun that ejects its spent shell casings after firing, but after tramping around in the woods in the dark, the search did not turn up either a casing or a bullet. And so, after marking the area for further investigation, by 6 p.m., Deputy Casino was ready to give the order for Judy's body to be removed from the scene, placed in the ambulance, and transported to the county morgue that was located inside Marquette General Hospital. Deputy Cusino already knew that the 12-person Ontonagon Sheriff's Department, which did not include crime scene techs, would have to get help from the state to investigate Judy's death. And that call for assistance went out to State Police Sergeant Detective Bill Ball at about 6:40 p.m., a little over 5 hours after Judy had left her parents' home to go walk the dogs. After getting the message that a woman had been found dead out and back of Cherry Lane in Ontonagon, 67 miles to the south, the 21-year veteran investigator immediately hopped into his cruiser. And an hour and a quarter later, Detective Ball was standing in the Ontonagon Sheriff's Department, listening intently to Deputy Casino summarize what law enforcement had found and done so far. Detective Ball had a well-earned reputation for not making assumptions about the cases he worked on, and for being tenacious about gathering the facts he felt he needed before reaching any conclusions. So, after going to view Judy's body in the morgue, the investigator did not immediately agree with the deputy medical examiner's suggestion that, like most shootings in the Upper Peninsula during deer hunting season, this death was accidental. And even if it turned out to be accidental, Detective Ball intended to find out how it had happened and whose bullet had actually killed Judy. So, even though it was now pitch dark, Detective Ball, along with 8 other members of local law enforcement, including the sheriff and Deputy Casino, headed back into the woods behind the Blake house where Judy's body had been found. And this time, using higher-powered flashlights, these searchers found something that the deputies' earlier search had missed. About 37 feet west of where Judy's body had been found, the sheriff was standing under a maple tree and pointing upwards with his flashlight at a fresh horizontal scar in the tree bark. Looking at that mark, both the sheriff and the detective knew they had just gotten their first potential break in the case. Because if that slash on the tree had been made by the bullet that killed Judy, then maybe they could figure out the bullet's trajectory and find the bullet as well as a spent shell casing that would help them identify what kind of weapon killed Judy. Detective Ball decided to order tracking dogs out at the scene for 9 a.m. the next morning, but in the meantime, at about 10:30 p.m., the detective decided it was time to talk with the grieving family. Deputy Casino, who had informed the Blakes and Judy's husband at about 5 p.m. that Judy had been killed, now joined the detective, and a few minutes later, the 2 men were walking out of the woods towards the Blakes' home on Cherry Lane. Looking up at the lighted windows of the house in front of him, Detective Ball was already especially interested in one particular person, Judy's husband, Bruce. Because in every case involving the death of a wife or husband, the first suspect is always the spouse. A few minutes later, the investigators were seated at the Blakes' kitchen table. Judy's mother, Mary Ann, had been given a sedative to control her hysteria, so the investigators conducted their initial interview with only 3 family members. Judy's father, Dale, her brother, David, who lived with his family in Ontonagon, and with Bruce. According to Deputy Casino, Bruce had been dumbfounded by the news of his wife's death, and one of his first questions to the deputy had been to ask if his wife had been wearing a blaze orange when she was found in the woods. After being told no, Bruce had leaned his forehead against the hospital wall and gently pounded his fists into its hard surface. Looking now at the stunned faces staring back at him from across the table, Detective Ball kept his questions short and to the point. He was just here to collect first impressions, find out when Judy was last seen, and to find out where each of these people he was speaking to were earlier that afternoon. By the time he left the house a half hour later, Detective Ball knew one thing for sure. Every person at that table appeared to have a solid alibi for the 4.5-hour window between the time Judy left the house to walk the dogs and the time when her body was discovered. On Tuesday, December 1st, one day after the end of Michigan's deer hunting season, and 2 days after Judy's death, one of Michigan's biggest newspapers ran a story with the headline, "Deer Season Gets Safer." In that article, which attributed 4 deaths and 25 injuries to hunting accidents in the 1992 season that had just come to an end, Judy's death was listed as a possible 5th accidental fatality, but one that was currently being investigated by local and state law enforcement. Ontonagon sheriff was quoted in the paper as appealing to anyone with information to please come forward. And 1 day later, on Wednesday, December 2nd, the day of Judy's funeral service in Ontonagon, Detective Ball received a phone call from the police department in Marquette, where Judy lived and worked. An officer there was passing along information from an anonymous caller, information that made Detective Ball decide it was time to head for Marquette to take a closer look into Judy's work life as well as her personal life. In the meantime, local officers were able to pinpoint the likely time of Judy's death to about 2 p.m. That's the time that several residents in the area had each heard a single gunshot coming from the woods behind Cherry Lane on November 29th. Detective Ball also had officers check out other leads, possible criminals who had recently been released from police custody, reports of unidentified or strange people in the area where Judy was found, and reports of anyone in that area who was seen carrying firearms. In addition, assuming now that Judy had been killed at around 2 p.m., Detective Ball ordered officers to double-check every alibi provided to them by Judy's husband, father, brothers, and cousins, along with the alibis of any other family member who was not actually inside of the Blake household when Judy was shot. But it was Detective Ball's decision to call in an Ontonagon civilian to assist in the investigation that would eventually give police their first real breakthrough. Armed with his metal detector, 42-year-old Dan Castle had earned a reputation among Ontonagon law enforcement for being able to recover hard-to-find evidence lost in the Upper Peninsula's dense forests. Now, on Thursday, December 3rd, Dan Castle was standing with Detective Ball and Deputy Casino at the exact place behind Cherry Lane where Judy's body had been discovered. A chemical wash applied to the blaze mark on the maple tree 37 feet away had revealed the presence of lead, a metal that is commonly found in bullets. Now, the man with a passion for finding buried treasure had the difficult, if not impossible, assignment of finding the bullet that had passed through Judy's body and then ricocheted off of that tree 5 days earlier. And while Dan was looking for that bullet, Detective Ball headed for Marquette County, where the Moylanens lived and worked. If Judy's death had not been an accident, the detective needed to find out who might have wanted her dead and why. It didn't take long for the state police investigator to realize that the anonymous caller had been right. Judy's life and Judy's past were much more complicated than Bruce and her family had led them to believe. Judy's co-workers and supervisors at the Marquette General Hospital would soon tell detectives why it had taken almost 2 weeks for the Moylanens to replace the station wagon Bruce had totaled on the first day of hunting season. According to the rumor mill, Judy was facing some serious financial issues, and just scraping together $500 for a down payment on the 5-year-old replacement van had been a big challenge. It would also turn out that Judy had recently contacted several of her creditors to ask about restructuring her loans, and when the bank turned down her application to refinance the couple's mortgage, Judy had mentioned to one of her coworkers that she and Bruce might be facing bankruptcy. But aside from learning about the Moylanens' financial problems, when it came to suspects in what could either be an accident or murder, the investigation seemed to be hitting one dead end after another. None of the reports of other hunters or suspicious people in or near the place where Judy died had turned up any viable leads. As for Judy's husband and other family members, police had not been able to find any hard evidence that would link any of them to Judy's death. Not only had Judy's husband, Bruce, prepared a list of people who could verify his whereabouts on November 29th, he had also willingly signed off on a consent to search form. That form gave police permission to examine and inventory Bruce's collection of firearms, as well as examine Judy's various life insurance policies, the payout from which could have provided a motive for Bruce to kill his wife. It would not be until mid-December that the state police investigator would get a series of tips that, together, would break the case wide open. The first of those tips came from Dan Castle up in Ontonagon. For 9 frustrating days, all Dan had found in the woods behind Cherry Lane were bottle caps and old coins. But on Sunday, December 13th, exactly 2 weeks after Judy was shot, Dan decided that before giving up the search for the bullet, he would try a simple physics experiment to pinpoint exactly where the bullet might have come to Earth. So, trading his metal detector for a slingshot and a pocket full of marbles, Dan stood in the exact location where Judy's body had been found and stooped to what he guessed would have been a point level with Judy's chest, where the bullet likely entered her body. Once in this position, Dan fired marble after marble at the blaze mark on the maple tree. And each time the marble ricocheted off the blaze, he made a careful note of where the marble landed. Once he had a cluster of marbles all in the same general area, Dan pocketed his slingshot and again took up his metal detector. And sure enough, in that area where the marbles had clustered, just 77 feet away from the maple tree and buried under a 2-inch layer of snow, Dan discovered a fresh bullet lying on top of the dead leaves that blanketed the ground. Dan grabbed his radio, and an hour later, Detective Ball was standing in the woods with Dan, both of them looking down at this critical new piece of evidence. And when the Marquette State Police Crime Lab ballistics expert arrived for work the next morning, Detective Ball was there waiting, sealed evidence bag in hand. And before the day was out, Detective Ball had 2 more important pieces of information. Crime tech experts had confirmed the .30 caliber bullet that Dan had recovered had in fact killed Judy. Embedded inside the bullet were not only traces of wood from the maple tree, but also fibers from the jacket and shirt that Judy had been wearing the day she was shot. The analysis also showed that Judy's death was no accident. According to the ballistics expert, the bullet was still rising as it passed through Judy's body before ricocheting off the maple tree, which meant it had been fired not from some great distance away, but at close range, and by someone who had put the sights of their guns squarely on Judy's chest. And by the end of that day, the lab had also provided Detective Ball with a list of guns that could have fired a .30 caliber bullet and left distinctive markings that matched the ones they found on this particular bullet. On the same day that Dan Castle had discovered the bullet that killed Judy, Detective Ball received a final tip from a hospital administrator at Portage Hospital in Hancock, Michigan, about 2 hours north of Marquette General Hospital, where Judy also had a job in hospital administration. 36-year-old Gail Lampinen wanted to talk with police about a person who she claimed had been stalking her and who also might have a connection to Judy's death. 2 weeks later, Detective Ball would hear a similar story about the same stalker from another hospital employee, Judy's good childhood friend, Leanne Wysocki, who was employed as a nurse at Marquette General Hospital. But it wasn't until Gail opened a box of sweaters that this stalker had given her as a gift that the police were able to connect all this information together to finally uncover the identity of the person who killed Judy Moylanen. And what they discovered would become one of the most sensational crime stories to ever come out of Michigan's remote and mysterious Upper Peninsula. Based on Detective Ball's investigation into the information provided by these two women, here is a recreation of what happened to Judy Moylanen on the last day of her life, Sunday afternoon, November 29th, 1992. After spending the morning inside the house, helping her mother prepare the traditional Sunday after Thanksgiving lunch of turkey casserole and then washing up the dishes afterward, Judy was glad for the chance to get outside and take all 5 dogs for a walk in the woods that she loved. Even though Streak was not as well trained as the Moylanen's dogs, Judy figured he would stay with the pack as they walked. And if he didn't, Judy knew there was only one place Streak would go, and that was home to her parents' house. As Judy let her dogs out of their kennels behind the house, she pulled her black down coat a little tighter around her. Even after the scare she and Bruce had had when they were out hunting on Friday at Dishnaw Creek, when that bullet from behind them had come so close to where Judy stood near her hunting blind, Judy still hadn't bothered to put on a blaze orange safety vest for this walk with the dogs. Unlike Dishnaw Creek, the woods she now stepped into were too close to the houses on Cherry Lane to attract any hunters. And so, as Judy and the dogs stepped into the woods, the bright pink of her shirt collar was quickly swallowed up among the trees. But to Judy's killer, it wouldn't have mattered if the 35-year-old mother was wearing an entire outfit of blaze orange, because the murderer was not hiding in the woods that afternoon to hunt. The murderer, who was maybe just 50 yards from the path Judy was most likely to follow, was there to kill. And at this distance, hitting Judy was going to be an easy shot. And when it was all over, the murderer was confident that it would look like just another tragic deer hunting accident. Stray bullets had been known to travel so far in these woods that the hunters who fired them would have no idea that they might have struck a human and not a deer. And besides, Judy already appeared to be a very accident-prone person. She had a 5-inch long scar on her head from a concussion that happened a year earlier, and after that, there had been a fire in the Moylanen house that could have done some serious damage if the smell of smoke hadn't caused Judy to wake up and put the fire out. And whatever the risks, once this was done, once the killer had gotten rid of Judy, the killer would then be able to concentrate on 2 other women, Gail Lampinen and Leanne Wysocki. The first time Judy passed by the killer's hideout, the killer only raised their rifle and aimed, placing the sights on Judy's chest, but not pulling the trigger. This trail led to a field where the dogs could run, and then Judy would pass this way again on her way back to her parents' house. Better to wait, so anyone back at the house wouldn't connect the sound of a shot to Judy just having left for her walk. Sure enough, a few minutes after 2 p.m., the killer could hear Judy and the dogs once again approaching the killer's hiding place. This time, when the killer leveled their sights on the side of Judy's chest, they pulled the trigger. The gunshot seemed to echo like a bolt of thunder through the quiet woods, and one of the dogs immediately broke from the pack and ran in the direction of the Blake house on Cherry Lane. Even as the killer ran through the woods to the nearby empty lot where they had parked their vehicle, the killer knew they'd been lucky. Instead of giving chase, the other 4 dogs just stayed right where they were. As the medical examiner's report would later show, the single bullet that killed Judy entered her body just under her right armpit before exiting through her left rear shoulder, ricocheting off the maple tree 37 feet away and landing in the sodden leaves where Dan Castle would discover it 14 days later. On its way through the soft tissues of Judy's chest cavity, the bullet basically tore off the top of Judy's heart. After the bullet had struck and killed Judy, she fell on her side at a right angle to the trail, her head on a slight rise and her feet in a pool of icy water. All 4 of her dogs would stay close to her body for another 2 hours. That's when Judy's mother would also walk into the woods looking for Judy and blow the dog whistle that finally called the dogs home. There was nothing Judy's killer could do to retrieve the bullet they had fired, but the killer had made sure to collect the spent shell casing before leaving the woods. Later, the killer would use a torch to destroy the gun and shell casing before disposing of the weapon in the nearby Ford River. On December 13th, 14 days after Judy's murder, Gail Lampinen decided to open the 5 boxes that had been left on her doorstep the day before. Happily married, Gail had already confided to her husband about the unwanted attention she had been receiving at work and now apparently at home. But looking down at the pile of cardboard boxes at her feet, Gail was forced to admit that unwanted attention was an understatement. This looked more like the behavior of a full-blown stalker. Taking the first box into her bedroom, Gail opened it and looked inside. Neatly folded and packed, she saw a collection of women's sweaters in various styles and colors, but as Gail took each sweater out of the box, she realized they were not new sweaters. And a moment later, she pulled out a piece of yellow-lined notepaper. It was a letter addressed to her, dated 6 months earlier, and it was signed by Judy Moylannon, a woman, as Gail well knew, who was now dead. Gail had hardly finished reading the note before her hand was on the telephone, and a few minutes later, she was connected to Detective Ball's office, where she left a detailed message for the investigator. The letter may have been signed by Judy Moylannon, but there was no doubt in Gail's mind who the real author was. It was the same man who had left those boxes, the same man who had been sending her suggestive cards and notes, stopping by her office and showing up unannounced at the Lampinen house. It was, in fact, the same man who had been bragging to her just a few days ago that before long he'd be quitting his job as a technician at Marquette General Hospital thanks to a financial windfall that was about to make him a very wealthy man. And when Detective Ball returned to his office and called Gail back, he could practically hear the last few pieces of the puzzle fall into place. It would take months to prove their case, but Detective Ball and his team of investigators now had the bullet, the gun, the motive, and the evidence they needed to bring Bruce Moylannon, Judy's husband and killer, to justice. It would turn out the Moylannons' financial problems could all be traced to Bruce's poor money management, bad business decisions, and potentially fraudulent activity involving his insurance company, North County Claim Service. But Judy had only recently become aware of just how bad their money situation was. It was only when the couple's application to refinance their home was turned down that Judy had called the bank and realized that because of Bruce's money mismanagement, the family was facing possible bankruptcy and legal action. And, as Judy confided to a close friend, over the following weeks, Judy was learning more and more things about Bruce that made her scared and unhappy. Meanwhile, when Judy confronted Bruce about their precarious financial situation, Bruce became convinced that Judy would divorce him and take half of all of his assets. To Bruce, a much better option was to kill his wife and make it look like an accident. And while Bruce had insisted to police that the payout on Judy's insurance policies could hardly amount to more than $40,000, when police had searched Bruce's house in mid-December, they realized he was lying. While no single insurance policy on Judy was worth a fortune, Bruce had made sure he had taken out multiple policies on his wife. Hidden in an attic crawl space in the Moylannon house, Detective Ball had found a whole packet of those policies. And in the event of an accidental death, when the payout doubled, like a deer hunting fatality, when you added all the policies together, Bruce stood to walk away from Judy's death with a total of more than $300,000, an amount that would be worth $637,000 in 2022. The Moylanen's paperwork also revealed that in addition to a financial motive for wanting Judy dead, Bruce did in fact own a rifle that could have fired the fatal bullet that Dan Castle recovered. Listed as one of Bruce's assets on a loan application was a Remington 300 Savage, one of the weapons that the state crime lab said could have caused the distinctive riflings on the bullet that killed Judy. As for Bruce's alibi, he lied about that too. And once police interviewed every person on Bruce's list, they realized Bruce could not account for where he was between 1:45 and 2:45 on the afternoon that Judy was killed. But even though recent financial problems may have pushed Bruce and Judy to the breaking point, serious problems in the marriage had shown up at least 2 years earlier. That's when Bruce met Gail Lampinen at Portage Hospital when he was making a delivery there. Known throughout the hospitals in the area as an aggressive and awkward flirt, Bruce seemed to have fallen especially hard for Gail, even though she and her husband did their best to discourage Bruce from visiting and calling Gail. And once Judy was dead, Bruce launched an all-out romantic assault on Gail, one so obvious it prompted that first anonymous tip to police in Marquette, in which the caller reported that Bruce was stalking a hospital employee. As for the letter Gail had found, enclosed with the boxes of sweaters Bruce had dropped off at the Lampinen house, Bruce, writing as Judy, told Gail that the couple had grown apart and would soon be getting a divorce, and that Bruce would need Gail's help in finding a new partner, a woman exactly like Gail herself. But even without the handwriting analysis that confirmed Bruce was the author of the so-called sweater letter, it was the postscript at the end of the note that convinced Gail that Bruce had written the letter as a way of speaking directly to her. Quote, P.S. Don't tell the prospects, but believe it or not, Bruce is incredible in the sack. Not that Gail was the only target of Bruce's unwanted advances. The day after Judy's funeral, Bruce also started hitting on Judy's best childhood friend, Leanne Wysocki, a nurse at Marquette General Hospital, even going so far as to suggest that she might want to move in with him and 3-year-old Elise. And as Leanne reported to Detective Ball in late December, Bruce had told Leanne details about the shooting that had not been made public and that only Judy's killer would know, like exactly how the bullet had entered Judy's body just when her arm was swinging back, and how it was the perfect timing of that shot that resulted in the massive internal injuries that killed his wife. It would also turn out that Bruce may have made 2 earlier attempts on Judy's life. Back in 1991, so a year before Judy was killed, he apparently pushed an 85-pound chimney block off the roof of their house onto Judy's head. If the block had not glanced off of her head, Judy likely would have died rather than sustaining a severe concussion that put her in the hospital for 3 days with no memory of what had happened to her and a 5-inch gash on her scalp. A few months after that, Judy woke up one morning and found the house full of smoke. It would turn out that before leaving to go hunting, while Judy and Elise were still both asleep, Bruce had dropped live embers from the wood stove onto a pile of dry firewood in the basement. But despite the growing mountain of circumstantial evidence against him, it wasn't until Bruce failed a lie detector test and police showed him a copy of the sweater letter that he had written to Gail that Judy's husband finally confessed to killing his wife. On April 23, 1993, 5 months after Judy's death, Bruce told investigators, and later Judy's own brother David, that Bruce just couldn't take it anymore and suddenly went nuts. He told Detective Ball that in addition to threatening him with divorce, Judy had been a tyrant whose long workdays forced Bruce to do more than his fair share of the cooking and childcare. As for the timing of Judy's murder, Bruce said that it was just a lucky guess that Judy would go out that afternoon to walk the dogs. He said that the first time Judy had passed him on the path in the woods, that he just couldn't bring himself to shoot her. And then on her return trip, he said he aimed the rifle once and then lowered it, and then raised it one more time, closed his eyes, and pulled the trigger. On December 15, 1993, Bruce Moylannon was convicted of premeditated first-degree murder. He would later be sentenced to life in prison without parole. The only time Bruce showed any emotion during his trial was when Gail Lampinen took the stand to testify against him, at which point Bruce began to sob uncontrollably. Judy's brother, David Blake, and his wife, Yvonne, adopted and raised the Moylannons' little girl, Elise. Judy's mother, Marianne Blake, died at the age of 71 on November 29, 2007, exactly 15 years to the day that her only daughter was murdered. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you got something out of this episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to house sit for the Amazon Music follow button. But when you get there, just prop all their doors and windows open and leave. This podcast airs every Monday and Thursday morning, but in the meantime, you can always watch one of the hundreds of stories we have posted on our main YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. Consider donating to our charity. It's called the MrBallen Foundation, and it provides support to victims of violent crime as well as their families. Monthly donors to the MrBallen Foundation Honor Them Society will receive free gifts and exclusive invites to special live events. Go to MrBallen.Foundation and click Get Involved to join the Honor Them Society today. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me on any major social media platform and then send me a direct message. My username is just @MrBallen, and I really do read the majority of my DMs. Lastly, we have some really cool merchandise, so head on over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On a spring morning in 2017, a mother of three in Evansville, Indiana, logged onto Facebook and noticed a story in her newsfeed that made her heart start to race. Just a couple of hours earlier, the body of a young woman had been found in a field one town over, and police still had no clue who the young woman was. Now, the physical description was vague, but it matched all three of the mother's daughters. So right away, she picked up her phone and began trying to reach each of them to make sure they were okay. The two youngest girls replied within minutes, but the oldest one of them did not. And with every minute that passed by without a word from her, the mother became more and more frantic until she finally reached out to a friend of hers on the police force. And what she would soon learn, before the morning ended, would change her family's life forever, and change the course of two separate police investigations. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week. Once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please tape an air horn behind the follow button's front door to act as their new doorstop. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the afternoon of Sunday, April 23, 2017, 20-year-old Haley Rathgaber walked across the busy dining room of the Texas Roadhouse restaurant in Evansville, Indiana, carrying 2 plates of hot food from the kitchen. Haley stopped at a table near a window and set the plates down in front of a pair of customers. Then she gave a big smile and told them to enjoy the meal. But as Haley walked back towards the kitchen, she happened to glance up at the clock on the wall, and when she saw the time, her smile totally disappeared, and she felt this jolt of anxiety. Haley knew in a little under an hour, her shift would be over, and she would no longer have work to take her mind off this insane secret that she was keeping from almost everybody she knew. Earlier that month, one of Haley's best friends, a young woman named Jordan Hughes, had lost her 10-month-old baby in a devastating accident. Jordan's boyfriend, who was not the baby's father, but was helping take care of him, had been home alone with the baby. He'd strapped the baby into a car seat and started walking down the stairs in the house when he suddenly tripped over a diaper bag, and he and the baby both went tumbling down the steps, which ultimately resulted in the child's death. Or at least, that's what he had told his girlfriend Jordan and the police. Jordan had gotten the news quickly about her child and rushed to the hospital, hoping her baby would survive. And she told Haley everything that had happened and asked Haley to go to her house to pick up some things for her and bring them back to the hospital. But when Haley got to Jordan's house, she quickly realized that the story Jordan's boyfriend had told them didn't make any sense. The diaper bag that the boyfriend had supposedly tripped over was neatly placed on the couch, and it looked like it had never even been used, let alone tripped over in this dramatic fashion that the boyfriend had described. Haley had also noticed there was no scuff marks on the stairs or the nearby wall. Nothing anywhere inside the house appeared to be damaged or in disorder, and practically everything she saw seemed to contradict the boyfriend's story. And so by the time Haley had left Jordan's house, she was convinced that Jordan's boyfriend, a guy named Thaddeus Rice, was lying. And when the baby had eventually died at the hospital, Haley felt almost positive that Thaddeus had something to do with the baby's death. Back in the busy restaurant, Haley grabbed more food from the kitchen and delivered it to one of her tables. For some reason, whenever she was helping customers or talking to her close friends she worked with, a small group that called themselves the Roadies, she could totally block out everything she'd seen in Jordan's house. The second she closed out her final table, Haley felt like she might have a panic attack right there in the middle of the restaurant. Haley took a seat at the restaurant bar and tried to catch her breath. She removed her work apron and then reached inside the front pouch of the apron and pulled out a thick wad of cash, her tip money for the night. She slipped the cash into her jeans pocket and just kept taking deep breaths, trying as hard as she could to calm herself down. Haley suddenly felt a hand on her back, and she turned and saw her friend and coworker, Ainsley Bowles, take the seat next to her. Haley had only shared the secret with two people, her mother and Ainsley. And while Haley's mother had told her to go talk to the police immediately about Thaddeus, Ainsley understood why Haley still had not done that. Because Ainsley and Haley were both afraid of Thaddeus. He was their friend's boyfriend, so they'd always tried to get along with him, but they knew Thaddeus had a criminal record and had been involved in at least one rape case. Ainsley asked Haley how she was holding up. But before Haley could answer, another member of the roadie crew, Jake Allen, walked up to the bar and announced that he was hosting a small hangout after he got off work, and if anybody wanted to come over and have drinks, they were welcome. He said so far, their friend and fellow roadie Isaiah would be there, but he was hoping more people would come. Haley thought about it for a second. Now, she loved hanging out with Jake and Isaiah and the rest of the roadie's crew, and specifically with Jake and Isaiah, she would typically confide in both of them about everything, like she did with Ainsley. But right now, she just didn't want to tell these guys what was going on with her because Jake and Isaiah could be very protective of Haley and Ainsley, and she didn't want them doing anything stupid or drastic once they learned about her theory around Thaddeus and the baby. Also, Haley and Ainsley had a big exam in one of their college classes the following morning. And so ultimately, Haley and Ainsley thanked Jake for the offer, but said they would both have to pass this time. Jake said he totally understood, but if either of them changed their minds, they knew how to reach him. Jake returned to work, and Haley and Ainsley stayed at the bar. And at some point, in a voice barely above a whisper, Ainsley asked Haley if she was going to finally tell Thaddeus's girlfriend, or the cops, about her suspicions. Haley looked down and said she still had no clue. Every time she thought about it, she got so scared about what Thaddeus might do to her. Later that evening, Haley was at her apartment alone, studying for her big exam and still trying to keep her mind off of everything else, when she heard her phone vibrate on the table. She put down her notes, looked at her phone, and saw a text message. After reading it, Haley thought about it for a second. She knew she really should keep on studying, but this diversion might help her relax for a bit. So she picked up her phone and replied to the message, and then afterward, she headed to the bathroom to put on some makeup, and also change out of her t-shirt and sweats and put on a pair of jeans, a long-sleeve shirt, and a jacket. She was ready to go out. The next morning, so April 24th, a woman was driving her daughter to school along the route she always took. She knew this route so well, in fact, that sometimes she found herself zoning out completely while driving it, almost like she was on autopilot. But on this morning, as she approached the soccer field that stood out from the endless grassy overgrowth that surrounded the area, something caught this woman's attention. At first, she couldn't make out what she was seeing. All she could tell was that there was something strange in the soccer field's gravel parking lot. And then, as she continued down the road and got a little bit closer and realized what she was seeing, the woman slammed on the brakes and told her daughter to wait in the car. The woman got out of her car and ran over to the soccer parking lot, hoping maybe her eyes had just played a trick on her and she hadn't really seen what she thought she saw. But when she got closer, she knew she had been right. She grabbed her phone and called 911. About 15 minutes later, so just after 7 a.m., Warwick County Sheriff's investigator, Paul Cruz, pulled up to the soccer field, got out of his unmarked police car, and made his way past the yellow crime scene tape. Cruz greeted the deputies and members of the forensics team who had arrived shortly before him. Then he walked past them and continued a bit further across the lot, and there he saw a young woman lying dead in the gravel. Cruz knelt down next to her and saw a wound in the back of her head, which clearly looked like it came from a gunshot. And he also saw a blue towel that was covered in blood lying next to her. Cruz scanned the ground near the body, and he didn't see any drag marks or anything to indicate that this young woman had been taken to this location by force. He and the forensics team would obviously need to do a lot more work, but for now, Cruz figured the most logical explanation was that this young woman had been walking through the lot when someone approached her from behind and shot her. Cruz looked around the lot and got an eerie feeling. He didn't see a single streetlight or lamppost anywhere in sight. This area was totally desolate, so if this young woman had been killed last night or early in the morning, it would have been pitch black here. Cruz had no idea why this young woman was walking through this dark parking lot, but he did know it would have been really easy for someone to follow her without ever being seen. Cruz crouched down over the body again, and he noticed an area of bare gravel on both sides of one of the dead woman's legs. It almost looked like she had made a partial snow angel in the gravel with that leg, and this really upset Cruz, because it likely meant that this young woman had not died immediately after being shot. She had fallen to the ground and squirmed before dying. Cruz stood back up and stepped away from the body, and then asked a crime scene investigator if he or anyone else had found a wallet or any kind of ID at the scene. But the crime scene investigator just shook his head. The dead woman had nothing on her. No wallet, no cell phone, no keys, nothing. They had no idea who this victim was. Later that morning, about 15 miles away from that soccer field, Haley's mother, Heather Collins, poured herself a mug of coffee, sat down on her front porch, and opened up her laptop. Heather began by scrolling through Facebook, which she did every morning. But, as she read through the posts in her feed, she began seeing something that disturbed her. All her friends from town were posting the same story from the local news. It was about this unidentified young woman who was found dead that morning outside of town. Heather's kids were 3 young women, all close in age, and so Heather immediately felt the maternal instinct to check on them and make sure each of them was okay. And so she promptly sent text messages to her 2 youngest daughters, and then also to Haley, her oldest daughter. And within minutes, her phone lit up, and Heather was relieved to see responses from her 2 younger girls. But she didn't get a response from Haley. However, she wasn't surprised, because she knew Haley had an important exam that morning, and Haley usually prioritized school over anything else. But an hour went by, and Heather still had not heard from Haley, so she called Haley's phone. The call went straight to voicemail. Heather left her daughter a message, trying to disguise how worried she was starting to feel. The next 30 minutes slowed to a crawl, as Haley still didn't get in touch with her mother. And so finally, Heather picked up her phone again, and she called Haley's friend, Ainsley, who went to the same college as Haley. Ainsley answered, and before Heather could even explain why she was calling, Ainsley asked her what was going on. She said Haley had not shown up to class that morning and missed the big exam. When Haley's mother heard this, she immediately felt sick to her stomach and had this horrible sense of dread come over her. Heather hung up and began talking aloud, trying to soothe herself. This was not her child out by the soccer field. It couldn't be her. It can't be her. Heather kept repeating this over and over again like a mantra, trying to convince herself that Haley was really safe. But it didn't work. So, after desperately waiting to hear back from Haley for a bit longer and still not hearing from her, Heather grabbed her phone once more and called a friend of hers who happened to be a detective for the Evansville Police Department. And when the detective answered, Heather told him that she had heard the news about the unidentified body and she couldn't get in touch with her daughter Haley, and she was now really worried. Heather's detective friend told her that given where the body was found, that this case was actually out of his jurisdiction. However, he did have some contacts at the Warwick County Sheriff's Office, and he said he would call them to see what he could find out. Heather provided her detective friend a physical description of Haley. She had long, light brown hair with blonde highlights, and her teeth were always really bright white. Heather also told the detective the type of clothing Haley typically wore, and she sent him pictures of Haley's tattoos. Then she hung up and waited. A short time later, Heather's phone rang. It was now the Warwick County Sheriff's Office calling, and when they spoke to her, they said they actually wanted to speak to her in person. Haley's mother immediately began to shake, and she felt the blood drain from her face. She could think of only one reason why they would want to talk to her face to face, and she just wanted to curl up and die. Anything but face the news she knew she was about to hear. A short time later, Heather heard a knock on her door. When she opened it up, she saw it was deputies from the Warwick County Sheriff's Office. Heather immediately began to shake all over, and she felt the blood drain from her face. And as soon as she heard one of the deputies utter the words, "I'm sorry," Heather broke down and collapsed to the floor. Her daughter Haley was dead. Later that afternoon, investigator Cruz walked away from the crime scene at the soccer field, got into his car, and began driving across town. And as he drove, he felt very frustrated. Earlier, he'd gotten a call from the station, so he now knew his victim was a college student named Haley Rathgate. But that was about all he knew. He and his team had thoroughly combed the crime scene and the area surrounding it, but almost nothing had come from their search. Not even a single shell casing had turned up. In fact, the only evidence that had been bagged at the scene was that bloody blue towel found next to the body, which the medical examiner was sending off to the crime lab for DNA analysis. After a short drive, investigator Cruz pulled into the sheriff's station, and he walked in just as Heather, Haley's mom, was arriving. She was there to get more information about what happened to her daughter. Cruz very gently approached Heather, who was clearly still crying, and he told her how sorry he was that her daughter was gone, and he promised that he'd find out who did this and bring that person to justice. Cruz understood now was not a great time to sit down and ask Heather a bunch of questions, but he said he did need to ask her one thing. Could she think of anyone at all, who might have wanted to hurt Haley? Haley's mother didn't even hesitate. She looked right at Cruz and said she knew of one person for sure who would want to do this: Thaddeus Rice. When Cruz heard this name, he did a double take. Cruz knew this name very well, because Thaddeus Rice was a suspect in another case he was currently working on. So now Cruz really wanted to know more if Heather was comfortable still sharing. Heather said, of course, and she proceeded to tell him the whole story. And as Cruz listened to Heather, he knew exactly where the story was going, because this story was the other case he was investigating: the death of Thaddeus's girlfriend's baby boy. Heather told Cruz that Haley suspected Thaddeus might have been directly involved in the death of that baby. And so Heather said if Thaddeus knew Haley suspected him, he would have every reason to want to shut her up. Before Cruz could even respond, Heather took her phone out of her pocket and told him she needed to show him something. She unlocked her phone and quickly pulled up a message that a friend of Haley's had sent her just before Cruz had arrived at the station. It was a video that Thaddeus had recently posted to his social media. And in this video, Thaddeus is seen posing with a gun. Immediately after seeing this video, Cruz thanked Heather for the information, and he turned around, got back into his car, and drove to Thaddeus's workplace. And when he got there, Thaddeus happened to be outside on a break. However, the second Cruz stepped out of his car, Thaddeus waved him away dismissively and said he had nothing to say to him. Cruz made it clear to Thaddeus that he was not there to talk about the dead baby. Instead, he was there to talk about Haley. Thaddeus just stared back at Cruz, and Cruz honestly couldn't tell if Thaddeus was confused or scared. Finally, though, Thaddeus said he wouldn't talk to cops without an attorney, and then he turned and walked away. Cruz knew he could go after Thaddeus, but he also knew it wouldn't make a difference. Thaddeus was not about to talk to him. Thaddeus had been involved in enough criminal cases to understand his rights. But even without having a long conversation with him, Thaddeus's reaction to hearing Haley's name had just made him seem a whole lot more suspicious. Around the same time Cruz was confronting Thaddeus, a young man named Isaiah Hagen sat on his front porch staring at his phone. Isaiah was Haley's close friend and co-worker, one of the members of the Roadies crew, and right now he was looking at a series of text messages from other members of that group, specifically his friends Jake and Ainsley, saying that Haley had been found dead by the soccer field just outside of town. And so Isaiah was just processing it and beginning to cry, and then right at that moment, he heard his mother inside the house behind him, and he instinctively just got up, went inside, and hugged his mom, and began crying even harder. She asked him what was wrong, and Isaiah told her about Haley, and his mom couldn't believe what she was hearing. She worked for the county sheriff, so she knew all about the young woman who'd been found at the soccer field, but she had no idea this young woman was one of her son's good friends. Isaiah hugged his mother tighter and told her that none of this made any sense, because he'd just seen Haley the night before, and everything had seemed fine. How could she be dead? Isaiah's mom pulled away from him, and she told him she understood how upset he was, but he really needed to go talk to the lead investigator right away, because even if Isaiah didn't realize it, he might have seen something or heard Haley say something last night that could help investigators find her killer. Cruz was at the station sitting at his desk looking through Thaddeus's rap sheet when his phone rang. He picked up the call, and Isaiah introduced himself and said that his mother worked at the sheriff's station. Cruz asked if everything was okay, and Isaiah said he was calling about his friend Haley, the girl who'd been found at the soccer field. He explained to Cruz that he had just seen Haley the night before, and he wanted to help if he could. Cruz told Isaiah that he could help by walking him through everything he remembered from the previous night. This would help Cruz flesh out the timeline of Haley's final hours. Isaiah told Cruz that the night before, he had been at his friend Jake Allen's place playing video games when he got a text message from Haley. And in this text, she said she was going to meet someone at a local park where the college students sometimes hang out. And she asked Isaiah if he could give her a ride because she didn't want to leave her car there. Isaiah said that was no problem, so he had left Jake's place, went to Haley's, hung out with her for a minute, and then drove her to the park. Isaiah told Cruz he had no idea who she was meeting. He said he didn't ask her about it because it felt like it was none of his business, especially if she was meeting up with some guy who she was romantically involved with. Isaiah said after he dropped Haley off, he just went back to Jake's house and kept playing video games until very early in the morning. Inspector Cruz kept listening and writing everything down, but then suddenly Isaiah just went silent, and Cruz could hear him trying to catch his breath. And when Isaiah started talking again, it was clear he was very upset. He told Cruz he felt really guilty now, and he wished he had asked Haley who she was meeting, because maybe he could have done something to protect her, or at a minimum today been able to provide the police a suspect. Cruz told Isaiah that he appreciated him calling in, and that he would follow up if he had any questions. After getting off the phone with Isaiah, Cruz quickly scanned the list of coworkers that Haley worked with at the Texas Roadhouse, and just as he remembered, there was Jake Allen's name and a phone number right next to it. And so Cruz called Jake and asked him if he could verify the times he had hung out with Isaiah the night before, and Jake corroborated Isaiah's story. But while speaking to Jake, investigator Cruz looked up Jake's address, and he saw that Jake lived very close to the park where Isaiah said he dropped Haley off, and that park was only a few miles from the soccer field where Haley was found dead. And so Cruz began to question Jake about his own activities the previous night, and pretty quickly, the call took a very weird turn. Now, Cruz considered all of Haley's friends and coworkers to be possible suspects, but he really thought this call might just be a chance to cross Jake off his list. But Cruz noticed that Jake suddenly started to sound very nervous and defensive as soon as his actions were called into question. Jake insisted that he hadn't seen Haley at all the previous night. In fact, he hadn't seen Haley since work that afternoon. He said he had invited her and their other friend Ainsley over to hang out, but they both had declined. And then after talking about Haley for a minute, Jake suddenly shifted gears back to Isaiah, saying he thought it was very strange how Isaiah would just drive Haley out to the park and leave her there. Cruz let Jake keep talking, but he wondered if Jake had something to hide, and if that's why he was throwing suspicion onto his friend Isaiah. After hanging up with Jake, Cruz went back to his list of everyone who had worked at the Roadhouse with Haley. Up until this call, Cruz had really only been focused on Thaddeus, who didn't work at the Roadhouse, and he definitely still considered Thaddeus a major suspect with a very clear motive. But now, Cruz felt like he really should put some additional attention on the Roadhouse employees, specifically Jake and Isaiah. On the evening of April 26th, so 2 days after Haley's body had been found, Cruz and a couple of members from his team arrived at Jake's apartment. Cruz knocked on the door, and Jake's roommate answered. Cruz introduced himself and asked to speak to Jake. The young man turned and shouted for Jake, looking a little freaked out that a bunch of cops had just shown up at his door, and then the roommate walked away. A few seconds later, Jake approached the door, wearing a dress shirt with an untied tie hanging on the collar. Cruz said he was the detective who had talked to Jake on the phone, and he needed to ask him a few more questions. Jake said he understood, but he was getting ready to leave for a candlelight vigil some friends and family were having for Haley. This made Cruz pause for a second. His investigation wasn't even 2 days old, and he'd been going pretty much non-stop since it started, and he'd almost overlooked how young Haley was, and how many people her death must have affected. Still, Cruz needed some answers. He told Jake he would do his best not to keep him too long, but he needed Jake to go through everything he had done after he'd seen Haley at work on the day she died. And just like Jake had said to Cruz on the phone, he said after work he had gone home and met up with Isaiah to play video games. It was basically the same story. However, during this in-person exchange, Jake also said something about Isaiah that really stood out to Cruz and made him look at the case very differently. Cruz took notes on everything Jake told him, asked a few follow-up questions, and then he and his team left so Jake could get ready for the vigil. That night, a huge group of Haley's friends and family gathered by the soccer field where Haley had been found. The candles they lit cast a glow over the otherwise pitch-black parking lot. They laid down flowers, shared some of their favorite memories, and just talked about how much Haley had meant to all of them. Her closest friends from work left Haley's name tag and her Roadhouse cap and sweatshirt right next to a big handmade sign that simply said, "We love and miss you. Love, your roadies." On April 27th, the day after the vigil, Inspector Cruz received word from the crime lab that the results had come in on the bloody blue towel that had been found next to Haley's body. Only one DNA profile was found on the towel, and much to Cruz's disappointment, it was Haley's. Cruz had hoped he would catch a break and that these results would lead him right to the killer. But now that he knew that was not going to happen, he methodically went through his list of Haley's friends and coworkers another time. Thaddeus, who remained one of Cruz's primary suspects, still refused to say anything without a lawyer. But almost everyone else who had known Haley was willing to help and tell Cruz whatever they could. And the more Cruz spoke to Haley's friends, the more convinced he became that he was much closer to solving this case than he had initially thought. Because a lot of Haley's friends said things that pointed him in the same direction. So Cruz came up with an idea of how he might be able to track Haley's movements before she got to the soccer field where she was ultimately found. He got in his car, headed to Haley's neighborhood, and just started knocking on the door of every house or apartment complex he saw that had a security camera or a doorbell with a video camera. He asked anyone who answered if he could have the footage from their cameras to help him solve a crime. And everyone he spoke to said he absolutely could. And so after Cruz collected all of that footage from Haley's neighborhood, he did the same exact thing in Thaddeus' girlfriend's neighborhood, which is where Thaddeus spent most of his time. Over the next couple of days, Cruz sat at the station and sifted through hours upon hours of security footage that he had collected. The experience began to remind Cruz of the old cliche about watching paint dry, and at times, Cruz felt he'd much rather be looking at a freshly painted wall than at endless grainy footage of houses and apartment buildings in suburban Indiana. Cruz kept fighting off sleep and tried to keep his eyes glued on the footage as hours passed by without anything eventful happening, until he hit pay dirt. For a second, Cruz wasn't even really sure he was seeing what he thought he was seeing. After all, watching this footage for so long had basically sent him into a daze, so he rewound the footage and watched it again, and This time, he was sure he did see something that would help him close the case and bring Haley's murderer to justice. Cruz watched more footage to make sure he wasn't missing something. He also worked with his team to collect cell phone data, and he carried out a few more interviews just to be certain he was on the right track. And on April 29th, just 5 days after Haley's body was found, Inspector Cruz knew he had found Haley's killer. He arrested them, and after that, he discovered exactly what had happened to Haley on the night she died. Based on surveillance footage, interviews, and evidence gathered throughout the investigation, the following is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Haley Rathgaber on the night of April 23, 2017. Around 10:30 p.m. that night, the killer fished a 9mm handgun out of the closet and then left to go meet up with Haley. Haley got into the killer's car, and the killer began driving her to the soccer field, just outside of town. When they got there, Haley and the killer stepped out of the car and began walking across the gravel parking lot near the field, with only the headlights of the killer's car and the flashlight on Haley's phone to light the way. As they walked, the killer let Haley walk ahead of them, and without Haley noticing, the killer silently drew their 9mm handgun, raised it up, aimed, and fired a single shot into the back of Haley's head. Haley stumbled, and the killer took several steps back and watched as she fell. Haley collapsed onto her back. The only part of her body that was working now was her left leg, which she jerked back and forth in the gravel as her brain slowly shut down. The killer just stood there and watched as Haley died. And in that moment, for a second, the killer felt bad about what they had just done. But regardless, after she was dead, the killer turned away from the body, went back to their car, and grabbed a blue towel they happened to have in the back seat. The killer then walked back to Haley's body, knelt down, and used the towel to wipe up some of the blood. After that, they put the towel down, and then scooped up Haley's phone off the ground. They also reached into her pocket and pulled out her wallet, which contained $200 in cash. And then the killer stood up, took one more look at the body, and then turned and ran back to the car, carrying their gun and Haley's stuff with them. Later that night, the killer went to their friend's place and hung out playing video games all night, without ever showing the slightest hint of what they had just done. Haley's close friend and fellow roadie, Isaiah Hagen, was her killer. Isaiah, whose mother worked for the sheriff's department, had called Inspector Cruz and tried to make it look like he was helping the investigation. And Isaiah's call even threw some suspicion on his friend Jake for a time. However, when Cruz and his team met with Jake on the night of the candlelight vigil, Jake started talking about his friend Isaiah. He hated to admit it because the two young men had been really close for years, but Jake said Isaiah had been acting really strange lately. And this was because Isaiah had run into some serious money problems. It turned out that leading up to the murder, Isaiah had borrowed hundreds of dollars from his father and from Haley. While Haley had not confronted Isaiah about the money he owed her, Isaiah's father wanted to get paid back. So Isaiah decided to take the money he owed his dad from Haley. On the night of the murder, Isaiah was the one who texted Haley while she was studying and asked her if they could hang out because he really wanted to talk to her. And Haley decided she needed a break from studying and from everything else that was going on in her life, so she said yes. Isaiah picked Haley up, but he never drove her to the park to meet someone else like he had told police. Instead, he drove right to the soccer field, and shortly after getting out of the car, he shot and killed her. It's not clear if Isaiah first tried to just ask Haley for the money and, maybe she refused to give him money and that's what led to the murder, or if Isaiah simply picked Haley up with every intention of murdering her for the money. Either way, it resulted in Haley's death and Isaiah stealing the $200 out of her wallet. In the morning following the murder, right before sunrise, Isaiah drove around town, getting rid of his gun and Haley's belongings. Then he went back to his house and left the $200 from her wallet on the kitchen counter for his dad. After speaking to Jake in person, Cruz really began to suspect that Isaiah was the killer. But he still could not just write off Thaddeus, a man who had a criminal history, had potentially harmed or even killed a baby, and who Haley had been afraid of before she died. So Cruz collected cell phone data for Haley and also for both Isaiah and Thaddeus, and he also studied all the surveillance footage he had collected. Isaiah and Haley's cell phone data showed that they had at least been near the same locations, including the soccer field, at the same time on the night of the murder. And the surveillance footage showed Isaiah pulling up to Haley's place not too long before she was killed. The footage also showed that Thaddeus had been at his girlfriend's house at the time of the murder and throughout the entire night. And so even though the murder weapon was not recovered, Cruz felt confident he'd cracked the case and he arrested Isaiah. Isaiah insisted he would never hurt Haley and that he was innocent, but during his trial, his mother was put on the witness stand and she testified that Isaiah had privately admitted to her that he'd been the one who shot Haley. He had told his mother it was an accident, but the evidence in the case did not support that. It took the jury only 4 hours to find Isaiah guilty. In early August of 2018, he was sentenced to 60 years in prison. Thaddeus, who Haley believed had played a part in the death of his girlfriend's baby, was eventually found guilty of neglect of a dependent and reckless homicide in the death of the child. A quick note about our stories: they are all based on true events, but we sometimes use pseudonyms to protect the people involved, and some details are fictionalized for dramatic purposes. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. This podcast, the MrBallen podcast, and also MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, Wartime Stories, Run Fool, and Redacted. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts to find all of these shows. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. On a cold day in January of 2008, a woman named Judy got out of her car and hustled across the parking lot toward her church. There was no service this day. Judy was just here to clean the church. When Judy reached the side door, she fumbled around in her pocket for the keys, and then when she found the right one, she pulled it out, slid it into the lock, and then discovered the door was actually already unlocked. Now, Judy knew the door was supposed to be locked right now, so clearly someone had forgot to do that. And so feeling kind of annoyed, Judy pushed the door the rest of the way open, and right away she noticed the church office door on the other side of the building was open a crack. And so she walked right over there to tell the person inside that they need to lock the side door. But when Judy actually stepped foot inside of that office, the locked doors quickly became the last of her worries. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast, because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, after the Amazon Music follow button has spent the whole day cleaning their car, secretly sprinkle a huge handful of breadcrumbs all over the roof so a gaggle of Canadian geese swarm it and poop all over it. Okay, let's get into today's story. On Sunday, January 13th, 2008, Rhonda Smith sat in the back pew of the historic Trinity Lutheran Church in tiny Springfield Township, Pennsylvania, doing her best to try to stay calm. The 42-year-old choir singer knew that her pastor, Greg Shreves, would soon call her up to the pulpit to speak, so she was keeping a close eye on him, waiting for his signal. The winter sun streamed in through the stained glass windows of the 18th century sanctuary, and the rays caught the minister's beautiful pale blue eyes. And when this happened, Rhonda noticed, and right away she couldn't help but think to herself how unbelievably handsome the minister really was. At age 56, Shreves was an unlikely minister. He had spent decades as a country club golf pro and official on the professional golf tour before answering God's call in 2005. Shreves was more than 6 feet tall and very fit, and he had blonde hair that was still visible amongst his grays. And he was single. Now, Rhonda was not romantically involved with her minister. To her mind, it was just more of an intimate friendship. But she was deeply touched by everything the minister had done for her. On this particular Sunday, as Rhonda sat nervously in the pew, Pastor Shreves announced that a fundraising campaign he had launched to help Rhonda with her expenses had brought in $3,000. Then Pastor Shreves gave the signal to Rhonda for her to come up and say a few words. And so when Rhonda stood up and began walking towards the pulpit, the 100 or so people in the pews immediately began to applaud and cheer as she walked towards the front. By the time Rhonda was standing at the pulpit next to Pastor Shreves, she was totally embarrassed, but also very touched. Rhonda had actually asked Pastor Shreves for this opportunity to thank the whole congregation, but now that she was actually up there, she was shaking with anxiety. She looked over at Pastor Shreves, who nodded warmly to her, as if to say, "You can do this." So Rhonda took a deep breath, and then she began to speak. She would tell the members of the church that in the 2 years since she had been attending Trinity Lutheran, she had felt welcomed with open arms. This really felt like her home. Rhonda's voice broke as she admitted to the struggles in her life, struggles that many in the congregation already knew about. Rhonda was unable to work full-time because of her battles with mental illness, which had driven her at times to thoughts of suicide. She had been in danger of being evicted from her apartment because she couldn't afford her bills when Pastor Shreves stepped in and began raising money for her. Rhonda tearfully said she owed a debt of gratitude to everyone in the sanctuary as she looked out at all the beaming faces. Out in the crowd was Judy Zellner, a 60-year-old grandmother who was Rhonda's best friend at church. Judy had actually introduced herself to Rhonda on the very first day that Rhonda had shown up at Trinity. And in no time, they were having lunches together like old pals. There was also Mary Jane Fonder, who was also out in the pews, and she was a singer in the choir with Rhonda. Mary Jane was 65 years old and very eccentric. She often wore a wig, sometimes backwards, but she was so kind. One time, when Rhonda was not feeling very well, Mary Jane had baked her a blueberry pie as a way to cheer her up. And of course, there was Pastor Shreves standing right next to Rhonda, who had taken Rhonda under his wing and even offered her temporary work in the church office. Rhonda had never met a man that was so caring and loving. To close out her speech, Rhonda, again very tearfully, told the congregation how thankful she was, and she also said, I don't know what would have happened to me without all of your love and support, so thank you. And then after that, the room broke into applause again. As Rhonda stepped down from the pulpit, Pastor Shreves made a show of smiling really wide and winking right at Rhonda, really letting her know how special she was. And as she walked back to her pew, feeling very special, she couldn't help but wonder if any of the other women in the congregation felt just a little jealous because of her obvious close relationship to Pastor Shreves, someone that all the women really seemed to like in this church. But just then, Rhonda noticed someone unfamiliar sitting in her row. The man had a gray beard, messy hair, and he wore glasses. His clothes looked rumpled, and Rhonda noticed that he was actually the only person in the entire church who was not clapping for her. The following Sunday, Rhonda did not go to church. Instead, she was sobbing uncontrollably on the phone with a mental health counselor, saying that she was a failure and couldn't drag herself out of bed. Social workers were so worried about her that they visited Rhonda's apartment just to make sure she didn't hurt herself. When they got there, they found Rhonda in her pajamas, looking like she hadn't slept for days. The social workers really wanted her to sign up for an inpatient treatment program, but Rhonda said absolutely not. She was supposed to start work as a temporary secretary for the church on Monday, and she was not about to miss that, even if it meant giving up going into this treatment program. She had made a promise to Pastor Shreves that she would do this job, and she was not about to let him down. Rhonda knew that she was repeating a familiar pattern. Just when something good was right within reach, she would have a mental breakdown that kind of ruined it. She had always dreamed of being a teacher, but these bouts of depression and anorexia had kind of doomed her ambitions. Now she was unemployed in her 40s, and her romantic life was not much better. Rhonda was a smart and attractive person, but her relationships always fell apart. At one point, she had poured her heart out to Pastor Shreves about her history of bad boyfriends. And when she did, he put his arm around her and he reminded her that it only takes one good person. Pastor Shreves called that Sunday night to check in on Rhonda after she didn't come to church. He wanted to make sure Rhonda was okay, but he also wanted to make sure that she'd be able to work the next day. The pastor was going to be away at a conference, and so he needed someone there at the church to answer the phones. And Rhonda promised him she would be there bright and early. By Wednesday morning, so 3 days into her temporary job, Rhonda had learned the routine of her new job, but it was making her lonely. From 9 to 5 every day, Rhonda was supposed to sit in this little plain office inside of the church and just wait for the phone to ring. With Pastor Shreves gone, she was the only person in the church, so she had no one to talk to while she worked and way too much time to think about her own problems. But on this Wednesday, she did her best to cheer herself up by reminding herself that she had a date that day after work. He was a nice man that she'd met in a bipolar disorder support group, so maybe he would understand the ups and downs of her life. But right now, the end of the day when that date was going to start seemed really far off to Rhonda. Rhonda wished someone, anyone, would call just to break up the monotony of the day. Even if that call came from the very eccentric, backwards wig-wearing Mary Jane Fonder, who often called the church and seemed totally confused. In fact, Mary Jane had called the church on Rhonda's first day of work on Monday, and when Mary Jane realized that Rhonda was filling in for the receptionist, Mary Jane promptly wished Rhonda a belated happy birthday. It was not Rhonda's birthday, but she said that she appreciated Mary Jane's thoughtfulness. But then Mary Jane began asking Rhonda, "Well, why didn't you invite me to your birthday party?" Rhonda had said there was no party, but Mary Jane just did not believe her. Rhonda had finally made an excuse to get off the phone. But now, 2 days later, sitting in this room feeling so bored, left with these horrible thoughts in her head, Rhonda kind of wished Mary Jane would call. At least it was something to do. Rhonda had talked to mental health counselors 4 times in the past week as she felt herself slipping into the blackness of depression. Her parents were really worried about her. Her dad called her every morning just to hear Rhonda reassure him that she was up and at 'em. Rhonda wished that she really felt that way. At 10:55 a.m. that day, the metallic clunk of the church's side door opening broke the silence. Rhonda thought it might be Pastor Shreves, back from his conference earlier than expected, and for a moment, she was really excited. Rhonda swiveled around her chair, getting ready to greet the minister, but to her surprise, it was not Pastor Shreves. It was somebody else, and she couldn't really understand why they were there. But what surprised Rhonda even more was what this person was carrying in their hand. Two hours later, at 1 p.m., Judy Zellner, who was Rhonda's best friend at church, parked outside of Trinity Church and stepped out of her van into the crisp winter air. Judy had long ago lost her tolerance for cold days like this, and so she made a beeline for the church building. Judy fumbled for her keys, eager to get inside of the warm building. She glanced into the ground floor window of the church offices, but didn't see anybody inside. Judy was the sexton of this church, which, she would joke, was a fancy way of saying she was the cleaning lady. And on this day, that was why she was at the church, to clean it. When Judy finally found the right key and put it inside the lock, she was surprised to find the side door of the church was actually already unlocked. Springfield Township was a community of only 5,000 people with very little crime, but the policy was, on weekdays, the church doors were supposed to be locked. But regardless, Judy stepped through the door and began to peel off her coat, and as she did, she looked up and noticed the door that led into the office where Rhonda was working was open. Judy walked over and stuck her head in the door and called out hello, but nobody called back. So Judy opened the door the rest of the way and she looked into the office, but there was no one sitting behind the desk, there was nobody inside the office, and she was about to leave and go walk around the church to find where this mystery person was who had unlocked the side door, when Judy spotted something just on the side of the desk inside of this office. It was somebody's foot. Judy at first didn't even know what to do, but then instinct took over and she rushed around the desk and she looked down and she could not believe what she was seeing. There was a woman laying face down in a pool of blood that had totally saturated the carpet beneath her. The woman's long brown hair was all matted red, and the side of her face that Judy could see was totally destroyed. It was like a shattered mess of flesh and bone. But whoever this woman was, she was still breathing. Judy could see her chest rising and falling. Judy wanted to roll this person over and try to perform CPR, but she could tell the woman's injuries were just too severe for her to help. Then it dawned on Judy, whoever hurt this person could still be inside the church. And so Judy snatched the church's cordless phone off its cradle and ran outside without her coat. Standing in the parking lot, freezing cold and shaking with fear, Judy dialed 911. When the dispatcher answered, Judy blurted out that somebody was attacked inside of her church. Paramedics and a state trooper arrived a few minutes later, and Judy showed them to the church office where she had found the woman on the ground. And when the paramedics went in there, the woman on the ground was still alive. And so the paramedics asked Judy to leave the office while they attended to this woman, and so Judy nodded and went back outside again, but then looped around to the side of the building and looked into the office through the window. And when she did, she saw the paramedics lift the woman off the ground and roll her over onto a backboard to take her out to the ambulance. And it was at this point that Judy finally got a look at this woman, and the woman who had been hurt was her dear friend, Rhonda. 17 miles away, Pennsylvania State Trooper Greg Stumpo was eating lunch at his favorite Italian restaurant when he got a call from dispatch. A woman had been apparently shot inside of the Trinity Lutheran Church, and she was barely clinging to life, and so could Stumpo report to the scene. Since Stumpo was the senior officer on his three-man detective team, Stumpo knew he would lead any investigation. Stumpo wolfed down the rest of his chicken parmesan and then hit the road for the church. Even though he had been a detective in rural Bucks County, Pennsylvania for almost a decade now, Stumpo really had never gotten to investigate many murders. Springfield Township itself had seen only 2 murders in the entire last 2 decades, and so Stumpo felt a big rush of adrenaline as he drove. By the time Stumpo arrived, the church was already crawling with police looking for physical evidence from the shooting. So Stumpo walked up to one of the other troopers and asked where he could find the woman who made the 911 call, Judy. The trooper immediately turned and pointed out to an idling van out in the parking lot. So Stumpo walked over and he knocked on Judy's window, which totally startled Judy. Judy had been sitting in her vehicle with the windows up, heat blasting, staring straight ahead, so shocked she couldn't even muster any tears. But she turned and looked over at Stumpo, and in his suit and tie, he did not look like a state trooper. And he very likely could tell that's what she was thinking, and so he reached down and picked up his badge and flashed it to her to show her who he was. At that point, Judy lowered down her window, but stayed in her van as she described for Stumpo what happened when she walked inside of the church. She would tell Stumpo that when she first walked into the office, the woman on the floor was so bloody and mangled that Judy didn't recognize that it was her good friend Rhonda. And Judy said at first she was positive this woman on the ground was dead, but then she realized her chest was rising and falling, and so she was still alive. Judy couldn't understand why anybody would want to hurt her friend Rhonda. Judy described Rhonda as being very sweet and shy, with kind eyes and a warm smile. She said the two of them had hit it off immediately when they first met, and they had become very close friends, despite the 20-year age difference between them. But Judy also told Stumpo that Rhonda had a dark side too. She struggled with bouts of depression that at times left her totally unable to function, and one time Rhonda had been so suicidal that she had to be hospitalized 5 years earlier. And Judy said, lately it seemed like Rhonda was slipping back into a depression. Stumpo was expressionless as he listened to Judy, but inside, based on what she was saying, he was beginning to wonder if maybe this was an attempted suicide rather than an attempted murder. But there was an immediate complication to that theory. Police had not recovered a weapon. If Rhonda shot herself, shouldn't the gun be right there at the scene? Maybe even still in her hand? After speaking with Judy, Stumpo went back inside the church and over to the church office where Rhonda had been found. And when he went in there, he noticed there was now a black tape outline of where Rhonda's body had been, and it was on this part of the rug that was now totally covered in blood. Stumpo got down on his hands and knees to see if maybe there was a gun under the desk or some of the other furniture nearby, but there was nothing. And then an idea occurred to Stumpo. Did someone help Rhonda shoot herself, perhaps disposing of the weapon for her afterwards? He went back outside to Judy's van and asked directly if she removed a gun from the office. Judy was totally offended at the very idea. She'd been careful not to disturb anything. But while Stumpo was inside, Judy said she had thought of someone that police might want to speak with. Judy said she recalled a very unkempt-looking stranger who had come to their church earlier in January when Rhonda had stood up before the congregation, and that was the first time that Judy had ever seen this guy. Judy said that on that day, as the donation plate was passed around, she overheard the stranger say something about how this church would be a good place to rob. Judy had not taken this comment seriously, but now she wondered, did this man shoot Rhonda while he was attempting to rob the church? Stumpo took down Judy's description of this man and figured it was possible that the stranger had come back to the church to rob it. Maybe Rhonda was just in the wrong place at the wrong time. As Stumpo headed to his car, he asked one of the troopers to make sure they spoke to the minister and see if he could figure out if anything valuable was missing from the church. After that, Stumpo drove to St. Luke's Hospital, where paramedics had taken Rhonda. Once he was there, he found Rhonda in a private room, heavily bandaged and unconscious. Her forlorn-looking parents stood vigil at her bedside. The doctor told Stumpo before he entered that Rhonda was being kept alive by machines, and it was very unlikely that she would survive after so much brain damage and loss of blood. Rhonda's parents, Jim and Dorothy Smith, who were both in their 70s, agreed to step outside to a waiting area with Stumpo where they could all chat. Stumpo brought them coffee in styrofoam cups, and he sat down and started by saying how very sorry he was about what had happened. Then Rhonda's father, Jim, told Stumpo about Rhonda's long struggle with bipolar disorder and the many times their daughter had flirted with suicide. Jim said he would never let Rhonda keep a gun around her apartment, and he would never keep one at his own house. Luckily, Jim added, the one time Rhonda had tried shooting a gun, she had hated it. And so Jim told Stumpo that he thought it was very unlikely that Rhonda would ever shoot herself. Jim told Stumpo that he and his wife Dorothy had not actually seen their daughter earlier that day. However, they had spoken to her around 8:30 a.m., and she sounded like she was in a good mood. Then again, Jim said, because of Rhonda's condition, her moods could sometimes change on a dime. 4 hours after that conversation, so at about 12:30 p.m., Jim and Dorothy had driven past the church on their way to lunch, and they saw Rhonda's car in the parking lot. The parents talked about stopping by and taking their daughter out for a bite, but they figured Rhonda was busy. Employment had been scarce for Rhonda, so they continued past the church and wound up eating lunch without her. The detective listened carefully and very sympathetically, but internally, he didn't get the feeling that these parents were going to actually offer up any information that could actually help investigators. But at the end of the conversation, Jim said something somewhat off the cuff to Stumpo that made Stumpo pause. Jim said that he prayed his daughter had not tried to kill herself. He and his wife were very religious, and they believed anybody who even attempted suicide faced eternal damnation, and so they couldn't bear such a fate for their beloved child. As the parents got up to leave, Jim told Stumpo that he really hoped investigators would not find a gun at the church. Jim's parting remark left Stumpo wondering whether they were telling the truth when they said they did not stop at the church on the way to lunch. Maybe, he thought, they walked into the church only to find their daughter lying on the floor from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. The parents could have mistakenly believed their daughter was already dead, and maybe they took the weapon from the scene so it didn't look like a suicide. Stumpo knew this idea was a total long shot, but it was too early to rule out anything. Just as Stumpo was about to walk out the front door of the hospital, he spotted a tall, middle-aged man with a priest collar in the hospital lobby. The man dabbed at his eyes and composed himself before pressing the elevator button. Stumpo walked over to him and asked the man if he was Pastor Shreves from Trinity Lutheran. Shreves nodded and said he was on his way up to minister to Rhonda's family. Stumpo asked him if he wouldn't mind speaking to him for a couple of minutes, and Pastor Shreves agreed. Shreves was so anxious to get up to Rhonda's bedside that he could barely sit still while the two men talked. Shreves said, he blamed himself for what happened because he had not been at the church to protect Rhonda. The pastor admitted that he really didn't know what he was going to say to Rhonda's parents when he got up there, or what he was going to say to the congregation. Despite his age, Shreves had only just graduated from the seminary 3 years earlier. Before that, he was competing in golf tournaments, and so nothing in his limited experience as a minister had prepared him for something like this. The pastor also said he didn't know Rhonda all that well, and he couldn't remember when she actually first joined the congregation. He described her as a very quiet, lonely young woman who had struggled with mental health issues. Stumpo sized up the minister as he spoke. The man was very handsome, as Judy had mentioned to Stumpo, but what really stood out to Stumpo was not this guy's good looks, but the fact that he did not see Rhonda as a close friend. He actually said, he was not that close with her. Judy had told Stumpo that Rhonda saw the pastor as a very dear friend and mentor. And so to Stumpo, it seemed very clear that Rhonda and Pastor Shreves' relationship was very imbalanced. However, Pastor Shreves did know enough about Rhonda to suggest to Stumpo that he really should look into Rhonda's troubled love life. Shreves said that Rhonda had told him at one point that she had been in a very abusive relationship a few years ago, and things had actually gotten so bad that Rhonda sought the help of a domestic abuse center. Shreves said he didn't know who this ex-boyfriend was, but it was clear to him that their relationship still weighed on Rhonda years after they parted ways. Pastor Shreves told Stumpo that Rhonda also had a more recent breakup with a man she had met online who lived in Philadelphia. Shreves said that as far as he knew, Rhonda and this guy had gone on a few dates, but then at some point the guy had stopped returning Rhonda's calls, and that had left Rhonda feeling very sad and very wounded. Shortly after this, Stumpo and Shreves wrapped up their conversation, and Stumpo headed out the door. And as Stumpo left the hospital, his head was spinning. He had only been investigating the shooting of Rhonda Smith for a few hours, but he already had an array of theories. Did she shoot herself? Was she caught up in an armed robbery? Was she a victim of an abusive former boyfriend? He couldn't prove or disprove any of these. 2 hours later, around 6 p.m., Stumpo got a phone call from another detective, and they told him that Rhonda Smith was dead. The parents had asked the doctors to take her off life support when it became clear she had absolutely no brain activity. And so the case now was no longer an attempted suicide or murder, it simply was a suicide or a murder. Rhonda was supposed to go on a date on the night that she died, and so Stumpo wasted no time figuring that out and then tracking the date down. The man's name was Gregory Danisavage, and Stumpo found him at his house just before 8 p.m., and he was still dressed in slacks and a blazer for his date that would never happen. Gregory said he was supposed to pick up Rhonda at her apartment at 6 p.m., but she didn't show, and she didn't send him a message to explain. And so he had sat outside in his car for a while, and then finally just went home, hoping that nothing had happened to her. Unfortunately, Stumpo said, something had happened to her, but he wouldn't provide any details. Stumpo asked where Gregory had been late on Wednesday morning, and he had a ready answer. He said he was taking care of his mother as she recovered from surgery. Now seeming a bit nervous, Gregory told Stumpo that the last guy Rhonda had been dating might have wanted to harm her. And so he said, Rhonda feared that that guy was just using her for sex, and so she had tried to slow the relationship down. But when she did that, the guy basically stopped calling her, at which point Rhonda began calling him, but he never picked up. Stumpo thanked Gregory for the tip, and then he left. However, when Stumpo followed up on Gregory's tip about this previous guy who Rhonda had been seeing, who apparently was just using her for sex, well, Stumpo quickly determined that it was a total dead end. The guy's name was Ray Finkel, and he would tell Stumpo that he had only gone on 4 dates with Rhonda, and he had stopped calling her really just because her house was too far away. Finkel said he was working all day Wednesday, the day that Rhonda was killed, and he had the security card check-in to prove it. As Stumpo ended the call with Ray Finkel, he was thinking that neither Gregory nor Ray even knew Rhonda well enough to want her dead. These were not exactly torrid love affairs. However, the abusive ex-boyfriend that Pastor Shreves had warned about turned out to be a much darker story. A social worker at the domestic abuse center that Rhonda had called said that Rhonda had accused this man of sexually assaulting her 4 years ago and getting her pregnant. Rhonda eventually got an abortion, but the social worker said that Rhonda was haunted by the experience. Then the social worker said that as part of Rhonda's therapy, she kept a journal of her relationship with her abuser. And so the social worker told Stumpo that maybe that journal would give investigators the information that they needed. Rhonda's parents gave Stumpo the spare key to their daughter's apartment. And then when Stumpo went into the apartment, inside of a desk drawer, he found all these yellow legal pads that were filled with Rhonda's writing. And the writing included all the intimate details of her past relationship with this man who had hurt her so badly. They painted a picture of a very unhappy romance, one that continued even after she accused this man of abuse. But Rhonda indicated in her more recent entries that she had not had any contact with this guy for 2 whole years. And so this abusive boyfriend really seemed like a bad person, but he didn't really fit the profile of Rhonda's murderer because he had not interacted with her in years. And so Stumpo now understood why people said Rhonda was unlucky in love, but so far, nothing in her past seemed to add up to a motive for murder. While Stumpo tracked down the rest of Rhonda's boyfriends, other members of his team began to look into that strange newcomer to the church, the kind of disheveled-looking guy who Judy had overheard say, Trinity Lutheran would be a good place to rob. Well, despite having a great description of this guy within 24 hours of the shooting, he was about 5'10", he wore wire-rimmed glasses and had scraggly salt and pepper hair. Despite having this description, none of the state databases of criminals and people on parole or probation contained anyone who looked like this stranger. Now, of course, Stumpo didn't just rule him out as a potential suspect simply because he couldn't find him. However, at the same time, the whole robbery idea just seemed kind of unlikely to Stumpo. Pastor Shreves had told Stumpo that the church rarely had any cash inside, and the pastor actually looked all around the church and couldn't find anything missing following the shooting. So if Rhonda really was the victim of a robbery gone bad, then why wasn't anything stolen? And so 2 days into this investigation, and Stumpo had almost nothing to show for all his effort. He wasn't even sure if he was investigating a murder or a suicide. A few days later, on Monday afternoon, January 28th, so 5 days after the murder, Stumpo sat in the balcony of the church as Pastor Shreves led Rhonda's memorial service below. More than 250 people had packed into the church to show their love for Rhonda. Stumpo looked down and saw Rhonda's parents sitting in the front row. And as he did, he considered the possibility that, the parents had covered up their daughter's suicide. It seemed extremely unlikely, but it was still possible. Then Stumpo scanned around the rest of the teary-eyed parishioners and thought to himself, if Rhonda did not kill herself, then the culprit was probably in this room. After the service ended, Stumpo waited for the crowd to thin, then he asked Pastor Shreves if he had a few minutes. Shreves walked Stumpo out of the church and across the parking lot to the small ranch house where he lived. As they reached his porch, Stumpo noticed an apple pie sitting in front of the side door to the house, but Pastor Shreves was not happy about this pie. As soon as he read the note that was sitting on top of the pie, Shreves expressed his irritation. He explained to Stumpo that one of the members of the church would often leave food for him, even though he had asked her to stop. Stumpo asked Shreves who this woman was, and Shreves would say her name was Mary Jane. The same Mary Jane who was very eccentric and wore her wigs backwards, and at one point had actually baked a pie for Rhonda. Shreves would say, Mary Jane was a member of the church's choir and she was a talented artist whose paintings hung on the walls of the church, but he said, I think she has a crush on me. And as the pastor talked, Stumpo remembered how people at the church said there was like this running joke that, Pastor Shreves was single and handsome, and basically all the women who went to this church had crushes on him, and some of them liked to bring him unsolicited gifts like food. And so Stumpo was pretty sure that Rhonda Smith must be one of these admirers, just like Mary Jane was. And, that was probably why their relationship seemed so imbalanced, with Rhonda looking at the pastor as this mentor and close friend, and the pastor basically being like, yeah, I know Rhonda, she's nice, but that's about it. Over the next few days, the events on the morning of the shooting became increasingly clear as investigators talked to more people and collected records. On the day Rhonda died, she had called a mental health crisis line from the church just after 10 a.m., saying she felt suicidal. Then at 10:55, she stopped using the church internet service, suggesting she was either shot right before then or right after that point. And so in Stumpo's mind, it was easy to imagine a desperate, lonely person making one last call for help before just ending it all. But then, on January 30th, Stumpo received the autopsy report. Sitting at his desk in the police barracks 15 miles from Springfield Township, Stumpo marveled at what he read in the report. It didn't solve the case by any means, but it did make one thing clear. This was no suicide. The medical examiner found that Rhonda had been shot twice. The first bullet glanced off her forehead, while the second round penetrated her skull. What's more, the shots were fired from 3 or 4 feet away, suggesting that the shooter was on the other side of the desk from Rhonda. The coroner said Rhonda's head had none of the tiny burn marks that are associated with shots fired at extremely close range, like a suicide gunshot would be. And so Stumpo concluded that, while Rhonda may have been depressed, she certainly did not pull the trigger to end her own life. She was definitely murdered. About a week later, on the evening of February 6th, Stumpo and another investigator named Bob Egan arrived at Trinity Lutheran Church just before 7 p.m. when choir practice was about to begin. One of the few members of the church community they had not spoken with yet was Mary Jane Fonder, though they had heard a lot about her. Mostly that she was very eccentric, wore her wig backwards sometimes, and periodically dropped off pies for the pastor and for Rhonda. And so Stumpo and the other investigator walked into the church, and right away they spotted Mary Jane, along with the other members of the choir, getting ready to start their practice, and the investigators flagged Mary Jane and asked her to come with them so they could talk to her in a side room. But as they were walking over to this room, Mary Jane said to them that she had actually been meaning to reach out to them because she had spoken to Rhonda a couple of days before she was killed. Mary Jane said she had called into the church and was surprised when Rhonda answered and not the normal secretary. But Mary Jane said she had actually just taken the time to talk to Rhonda because Mary Jane had been worried about Rhonda's state of mind, like many other people in the church were. And so Mary Jane told the investigators that Rhonda apparently had such a crush on Pastor Shreves that, at least to Mary Jane, it seemed like it was clouding her judgment. And the example that Mary Jane gave to show this was she said the minister had organized a birthday party for Rhonda just before her death, and Rhonda had not invited Mary Jane to attend, even though in Mary Jane's eyes, they were close friends. And so it just seemed like Rhonda was being weirdly protective of Pastor Shreves and didn't want other women there. Mary Jane would also tell the investigators that she was just too upset to even attend Rhonda's memorial service, but she had baked a pie for Rhonda's parents and visited with them after the service. Then Detective Egan asked Mary Jane point blank, did she own a gun? And Mary Jane kind of laughed and said no, and she wouldn't even know how to use one. So the detectives thanked Mary Jane for her time, and then she turned and headed back over to choir practice, and the detectives walked out of the church feeling like they were no closer to solving this crime, but having now met Mary Jane, she seemed less like this totally eccentric, weird person that people had made her out to be, and more just like a very harmless old lady. The following day, February 7th, Stumpo learned that the state police were reassigning the other 2 detectives in his unit to other cases that weren't even murders. Stumpo knew what that meant. His bosses were losing confidence in his investigation because he was not making enough progress. And so now the Rhonda murder investigation was down to just him and Detective Egan, who was on loan from headquarters. And as weeks passed by, still with no breakthrough, Stumpo began to worry that they might never solve this crime. But Detective Egan, who was a veteran homicide investigator, kept saying that you never know when a hot tip will come in the door. And that's exactly what happened on a cold and windy morning on Saturday, March 29th, nearly 9 weeks after Rhonda's murder. 6 miles from Trinity Lutheran Church, a man and his 8-year-old son were fishing in Lake Nakamixon under the bridge that runs across it. At some point, the boy noticed something shiny in the muddy, shallow water at the lake's edge. He pulled what looked like a toy gun out of the water and showed off his trophy to his dad. But when the boy's father took a look, he realized his son was not holding a toy, it was a real gun. The father snatched the revolver from the boy's hands and immediately popped open the cylinder and shook the weapon to make sure it was not loaded. 3 live rounds fell into the mud, plus the casing from a bullet which had already been fired. The boy's father called the state police barracks where Stumpo worked to report that his son had found a loaded gun in the lake, and the man wondered what he should do with it. The trooper who answered this phone call, whose name was Andrew Mincer, had been the first police officer on the scene at the Rhonda Smith shooting, and he immediately thought of the missing weapon from that crime. Mincer asked the father for the serial number on the gun, and after he got it, he told the father to hang onto the gun and give it to nobody else until he, Mincer, could get there to pick it up. As soon as Mincer hung up the phone, he ran the serial number through the National Crime Information Center, and in minutes, he learned who the Rossi .38 revolver was registered to. Stumpo was in the police barracks when this call came in, but he was down in the locker room thinking about how little time he had spent with his 5-year-old son lately. Police work was literally taking over Stumpo's life, and he had so little to show for it. Stumpo was about to head home when his cell phone rang. The call was coming from within the station he was standing in, and so Stumpo sighed at the thought of even more police work to do. But the instant Stumpo answered, Mincer, who was very excited, told him that a little boy who had been fishing out in Lake Nakamixon had just found a .38 caliber revolver just like the one that had been fired at Rhonda Smith. Mincer said the gun was purchased in 1994, 14 years before Rhonda's murder. But despite being a bit old and having been in the water, it still appeared to be in working condition. And so Stumpo suddenly felt totally energized, and he couldn't help but think, this sounds like we have just found the murder weapon. The next day was a Sunday, but the ballistics expert at the State Trooper Barracks happened to be in the crime lab that day, working on another case. Stumpo convinced him to drop what he was doing and test the gun the boy found in the lake against the slug that the coroner pulled from Rhonda. And the test proved the revolver found in the lake was the one that killed Rhonda. The next day, Detectives Stumpo and Egan visited the address associated with the original owner of the gun. And the property they went to was this rundown cabin at the end of a long driveway sitting on 11 acres of woods. Stumpo and Egan knew that this address was probably an important break in the case, but it didn't mean the original owner of this gun was definitely Rhonda's killer. It had been 14 years since this revolver was purchased, so plenty of time for the gun to change hands may be off the books. After Stumpo knocked, an old man wearing a dress shirt and a plastic pocket protector opened the door just a crack and peered out very suspiciously at the detectives. Egan asked if it would be okay if they came inside and spoke to him, and the man, very reluctantly, opened the door the rest of the way and stepped aside to let them come in. Stumpo and Egan were appalled by what they saw inside. The house was a hoarder's den. Junk-filled boxes and papers piled high and covered with cobwebs and bird droppings. The entire place just totally reeked, to the point where both detectives were breathing through their mouths just so they didn't have to smell the air. Now, the police knew this man was not the original owner of the gun. It was actually his sister who lived with him. And so the detectives asked him if his sister was home, but the man said she wasn't. So the detectives asked him if he knew that his sister had at one point purchased a .38 revolver. The man said that his sister had trouble with a coworker several years back and felt kind of threatened, so she had bought a gun. But she only shot it once in the yard for practice, and the noise was apparently too much for her. Her brother said that she had thrown the gun away years ago, and he didn't know where she threw it away, and he had never seen it or heard about it again. But Stumpo and Egan were not fully convinced about this story. They told the brother that the gun had just been pulled out of the lake. If the gun had been tossed into the water in 1994, shortly after his sister bought it, then by now it would be totally covered in rust. But the gun had no rust on it, which indicated it had not been in the lake for more than a few weeks. The brother fell quiet for a moment, and then told the investigators that he did have something to show them. He took them outside to his car, and he lifted the driver's floor mat to reveal something which shocked the two investigators, and it confirmed that they were on the right track. The old man showed the detectives shiny pieces of metal that were underneath the floor mat of his car, and the detectives immediately recognized these fragments as being part of a bullet casing. Now, when that boy had found the gun in the lake, it had contained 3 live rounds and 1 spent shell casing.
However, investigators knew that Rhonda had been shot twice, so there needed to be 2 spent shell casings. And so far, all they could account for was that one that the boy found in the gun. And now, these fragments on the floor of the car could be, potentially, pieces of that other spent round. At last, Stumpo finally had his primary suspect. It was this old man's sister, the original owner of this gun. And that afternoon, police were able to arrest her right as she left the Trinity Lutheran Church, driving her brother's car. The same car that police had just found those fragments from the shell casing underneath the floor mat. Also, after they made this arrest, police searched the inside of the car, and they found a calendar with January 23rd circled, the day Rhonda was murdered, and over that date on the calendar were the words, "Rhonda murdered." Based on Stumpo and Egan's investigation, here is what really happened on January 23rd, the day Rhonda was murdered. At 10:30 a.m. on January 23rd, the killer slipped into her brother's car and drove to Trinity Lutheran Church. She pulled into the parking lot, and as she did, she looked over at the first-floor office window, and she saw Rhonda sitting inside. The killer got out of the car, walked up to the side door of the church, they unlocked it, and went inside. Once inside, the killer looked around the building and determined that Rhonda was the only person inside. The killer then walked over to the church office where Rhonda was. She went inside, and as soon as she did, Rhonda's face lit up with recognition and a smile, until Rhonda noticed the revolver in the killer's hand. Seconds later, the killer raised the gun, aimed it at Rhonda, and fired. The shot struck Rhonda right in the forehead, knocking her off her chair and onto the floor. The killer rushed around the desk and stood over Rhonda, and right away they noticed the bullet had only grazed Rhonda's forehead. And so with Rhonda writhing in pain on the carpet, the killer backed up a couple of feet and then raised their gun again, aimed it at the side of Rhonda's head, and fired. And this time, the bullet went right into Rhonda's head. Satisfied that Rhonda was now dead, the killer casually left the church and drove to a hair appointment. After the detectives questioned her in connection with the murder, the killer got nervous and decided to get rid of the gun. So the killer borrowed her brother's car, drove 6 miles to that bridge that crossed over Lake Nakamixon, and the killer tossed the gun out the window without even stopping. And then, a month later, the boy and his father would find the gun. It would turn out the original owner of the gun and Rhonda's murderer was none other than the eccentric, backwards wig-wearing, apple pie-making Mary Jane Fonder. Mary Jane did not see Rhonda as a desperately lonely, depressed person on the brink of suicide. Instead, she saw Rhonda as this pretty young thing who was competing with her, Mary Jane, for the affection and love of Pastor Shreves. Mary Jane was convinced that Rhonda and the pastor were having this romantic love affair, even though they totally were not. In Mary Jane's mind, she believed that she and Pastor Shreves had this undeniable chemistry, and they were meant to be together. And she was sure he felt the same way, even though he repeatedly asked her to stop calling him and to basically leave him alone. The last straw for Mary Jane had been when the pastor had raised money to help Rhonda out, and then got the whole congregation to clap and applaud for her when she was up there speaking. No one ever helped out Mary Jane when she lost her job and needed money, and Mary Jane had been a member of the church for 14 years. Compared to her, Rhonda was a newcomer. So Mary Jane killed Rhonda out of spite and jealousy, and with the hope that once Rhonda was out of the way, Mary Jane would have the pastor all to herself. All of this was obviously delusional, but Mary Jane believed it. And it would turn out this wasn't the first time Mary Jane was connected to a suspicious death. Back in 1993, her 83-year-old father disappeared. Mary Jane, who was his caretaker, claimed that he walked out of the house and never came home. Now, at the time, police did suspect that Mary Jane had killed her father and either completely destroyed his body or managed to hide it really well. And Mary Jane, she remained under suspicion for this death, but police could never prove it. In the end, Mary Jane would be convicted of murdering Rhonda, and she would be sentenced to life in prison. However, she would die in prison only 10 years into her sentence. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more bone-chilling content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts, MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, Bedtime Stories, and Runful. Just search for Ballen Studios wherever you get your podcasts and you'll find them all. Also, there are hundreds more stories like the ones you heard today, but in video format on our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya. Just after midnight on July 19, 2010, former professional basketball player Lorenzen Wright stepped out of a car and began walking down a dirt path into the woods just outside of Memphis, Tennessee. Then suddenly, Lorenzen heard a strange sound coming from somewhere out in the darkness in front of him, and as he strained his eyes to see what it was, he suddenly saw the thing that was making the noise, and it was rushing right towards him. And so in a panic, Lorenzen just turned and began running blindly into the dark forest as fast as he possibly could, and as he ran, he fumbled for his phone to call for help. But eventually, the thing he saw would catch up to him. It would take authorities years to figure out what actually happened in the woods that night. But once the mystery was solved, it would shock not only the city of Memphis, but also the millions and millions of people across the country who watch professional basketball. But before we get into that story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right podcast because that's all we do, and we upload twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. So, if that's of interest to you, please offer to make the Amazon Music follow button a nice vegetarian dish, but secretly include several bits of barbecued Canadian street whale in the recipe. Okay, let's get into today's story. On the night of July 18, 2010, 34-year-old former NBA basketball player Lorenzen Wright, along with his old friend Phil Dotson, were driving in Phil's car through Memphis, Tennessee. Lorenzen lived in Atlanta, Georgia, but he'd grown up in Memphis, and so he was back in town to catch up with friends and family, and to really spend some time with his 6 children who lived there with his ex-wife, Shara. Phil and Lorenzen drove down a residential street, laughing together and talking about some of their best memories from when they were younger, and then Phil pulled into the parking lot of a local gym and parked out front. As Lorenzen got outside the car, he had to duck way down so he didn't bump his head on the roof of the car. Lorenzen was huge. He was 6 foot 11 inches tall, with long arms covered in tattoos. And even though he was retired from playing basketball professionally, he was still built like a world-class athlete. Lorenzen and Phil made their way into the gym and headed towards one of the basketball courts inside, where a group of teenage boys were playing a pickup game. And as Lorenzen got closer, he heard the sound of a basketball hitting the rim, and the boys shouting at each other and shoes squeaking on the court as the boys scrambled to grab the loose ball, and immediately Lorenzen smiled, because he loved the sound of basketball being played. Lorenzen and Phil moved around to the side of the court and sat down to watch the game. And as they sat there, Lorenzen began to smile even wider because he noticed his oldest son was one of the young men who was playing. Lorenzen didn't want to distract any of the kids, so he stepped back a little from the court and tried his best to stay out of sight. But at almost 7 feet tall, there was no way for him to hide. And so eventually one of the boys spotted him and shouted Lorenzen's name, and immediately the game came to a complete stop. And within seconds, Lorenzen's son and all the other boys rushed off the court, gathered around Lorenzen, and stared up at him in awe, because Lorenzen was a Memphis sports hero. Lorenzen's friends and family believed that he had been born to play basketball. His father had been a really good college player, and from the time Lorenzen was just a baby, his father had wanted him to follow in his footsteps. In fact, when Lorenzen was only a few days old and had only just come home from the hospital, his father had put Lorenzen's hands around a basketball, because his father believed that the more his son saw the basketball, the more likely it would be that Lorenzen would grow up to become a great basketball player. And as Lorenzen got older, he didn't let his father down. As a young man, Lorenzen had committed most of his time and energy to playing basketball. And when he grew to be 6 foot 11 inches as a teenager, his father and his coaches started to believe Lorenzen had a real chance to play professionally. Lorenzen would have an incredible senior year playing for his Memphis high school basketball team, and then he would go on to play college ball at the big-time program of the University of Memphis. But even on this big college team of all great players from around the country, Lorenzen stood out. And he was so good that after just his sophomore year, he left college, entered the NBA draft, and got drafted by the Los Angeles Clippers. So, at just 20 years old, Lorenzen had become an NBA player and had started making millions and millions of dollars a year. But Lorenzen's biggest joy playing professional basketball, even more than the money and the accolades, had come when he got traded to the Memphis Grizzlies in 2001, and he got to come home and play in the city he grew up in and loved. And even after Lorenzen had retired from the NBA several years later, he had made his home in Memphis with his wife and kids. And in his retirement, he quickly began running basketball camps for kids, he headed up charity events, and basically did anything he could to give back to the city that he believed had given him so much. So, as Lorenzen stood in that gym, talking to his son and his son's friends about basketball and playing in the NBA and anything else they wanted to know, he couldn't help but start to really miss living in Memphis. After talking to the kids on the basketball court for a while, Lorenzen and his son headed out of the gym with Phil, and Phil drove them to Lorenzen's ex-wife Shara's house in a wealthy Memphis suburb. Outside the house, Lorenzen thanked Phil for driving him around, and then he told Phil he'd text him in the next few days so they could hang out again before Lorenzen had to go back to Atlanta. Then Lorenzen and his son turned around and headed up a long walkway past the beautifully landscaped front lawn, opened the front door, and stepped into Shara's large 2-story house. And as soon as Lorenzen walked inside, he heard his other children yelling for him as they rushed to the door to see their dad. And Lorenzen crouched down and wrapped his long arms all around them in a big hug. And that night, Lorenzen just spent time talking to his kids, playing games with them, and catching up with Shara about what was going on in her life. Lorenzen had known Shara since they were in high school. She was the daughter of one of his basketball coaches at the time, and she was a few years older than Lorenzen. Shara was 5 foot 10 inches tall, had long dark hair, and, in Lorenzen's mind, a perfect smile. And when Lorenzen had first laid eyes on her, he thought she was one of the most beautiful women he had ever seen. And so, not long after they met, Lorenzen and Shara had started dating, and then they had basically grown up together, while Lorenzen went from being a college athlete to playing in the NBA. And for a long time, everything in their lives had seemed perfect. But then, after 13 years of marriage, Shara and Lorenzen had started to drift apart, and eventually they had gotten divorced, and Lorenzen had moved to Atlanta. But even after the divorce, Lorenzen and Shara remained close, and they worked hard to give their kids the best life possible. And whenever Lorenzen came to town, he always stayed with Shara and the kids at her house. So, sitting on the couch together, Shara and Lorenzen began to work out plans for their kids to go down to Atlanta with Lorenzen when he left later that week. And then Lorenzen told Shara he really wanted to hear all about the church where she had recently started serving as a pastor. Shara had always been religious, but she admitted to Lorenzen that it was actually really hard to lead a congregation. But she said she did love being a pastor, and she loved the church and the people who went there. And as they talked, again, Lorenzen felt this sudden wave of just really missing Memphis, and now really missing being a part of this family, living with his kids and living with Shara. And suddenly, all he wanted to do was find a way to repair his relationship with Shara and move back in with her permanently in Memphis. And Lorenzen suspected that that actually might be a real possibility because Shara had made it clear that she missed him too. So later that night, when Lorenzen said goodnight to the kids as they headed up to bed, he imagined a time, hopefully soon, when this would be his everyday life again. A little before midnight on July 18th, 2010, so a couple of hours after the kids had gone to bed, Lorenzen crept downstairs at Shara's house in the dark. He slid his hand down the banister, took slow steps, and tried to walk as quietly as possible so he wouldn't wake anybody up. Lorenzen made it to the first floor, he walked across the large entryway, he opened the front door, and stepped outside. And once he was outside, he closed the door behind him as quietly as possible. Outside, Lorenzen could already feel sweat dripping down his forehead. Even though it was almost midnight, the temperature was over 80 degrees Fahrenheit. Lorenzen wiped the sweat away and then looked out across the yard, and he saw a car pull up out front. Lorenzen glanced back at the house where his kids and Shara were sleeping, and then he turned and walked quickly to the car, opened the passenger side door, ducked way down, and climbed inside. The driver smiled at him, and then they pulled away from the house. And less than a half hour later, not long after midnight on the morning of July 19th, Lorenzen looked out the passenger side window and he watched the lights from Memphis disappear behind them. And soon after that, the driver turned the car onto a road that was surrounded by woods on both sides and that was about 15 miles south of downtown Memphis. Then, after looking in the rearview mirror to make sure nobody was behind them, the driver pulled onto a dirt path that led into the woods. They drove the car only a few yards down that path before they stopped and parked the car. Then the driver looked over at Lorenzen, nodded to him, and then the driver stepped out of the car. So Lorenzen ducked down and stepped out of the car as well, and began to follow the driver, who was walking deeper and deeper into the forest. And as Lorenzen walked, he could almost feel the trees closing in on him. Then Lorenzen heard a rustling sound in the trees ahead of them. He and the driver froze for a moment, and Lorenzen strained his eyes to try to see what had made the noise. But it was so dark, Lorenzen just couldn't tell what it was. And so a moment later, the driver and Lorenzen were walking again, but just a second later, Lorenzen heard the sound again. But this time, Lorenzen saw what was causing the noise, and he saw it was coming straight towards him. And so suddenly, in a terrified panic, Lorenzen darted off the dirt path, grabbed his phone out of his pocket, put his head down, and just started running as fast as he could into the dark woods. On July 22nd, so 3 days after Lorenzen had gone into the woods, his friend Phil Dotson was sitting on the couch at home watching TV when his phone rang. Phil grabbed his phone thinking it might be Lorenzen, but he saw Shara was calling. Phil had been waiting to hear back from Lorenzen so they could maybe hang out again before Lorenzen went back to Atlanta, but he knew Lorenzen was busy with the kids and seeing his parents, so he hadn't thought much about it. But as soon as he answered the phone, he could tell something was wrong. Because when Shara heard Phil's voice, she didn't even say hi. She just immediately asked if he had seen or heard from Lorenzen. Phil was totally confused and told Shara he didn't understand because he thought Lorenzen was staying with her and her kids. She said that he had, but a few nights earlier, Lorenzen had left the house to meet up with someone and he had never come back. Shara didn't say anything about this meetup, but Phil secretly wondered if she thought Lorenzen had gone to meet up with a woman. Because since the divorce, Lorenzen often had a few different women he was seeing at one time. But Shara just said she thought it was strange that it had been a couple of days now and that Lorenzen had not called to at least check on the kids. Phil said he agreed and that he would try to track Lorenzen down. So Phil hung up and immediately called Lorenzen. And when Lorenzen didn't answer, Phil sent him a text saying that it was really important for Lorenzen to get back to him as soon as possible. After that, Phil called Lorenzen's mom, and it turned out she hadn't heard from him either, and she was getting really worried too and thought something was wrong, and she was thinking about calling the police. Phil tried to keep her calm, but he knew it was no use. Lorenzen's mom was maybe closer to Lorenzen than anybody in the world, and if she was worried about her son, nobody could say anything to change her mind. After several more hours of not hearing anything from Lorenzen and discovering that no friends or family had heard from him since he left Shara's house a few nights earlier, Phil wound up calling Lorenzen's mom back again, and he told her that he too was now very worried. So Lorenzen's mom called the police in the suburb where Shara lived and reported that her son was missing. But the police response was not nearly as urgent as the people close to Lorenzen had hoped it would be. Over the next few days, there didn't seem to be any real progress made in trying to find Lorenzen. But the police would say that they had no reason to believe there was any foul play involved in Lorenzen's supposed disappearance, which was part of the reason why there was not a lot of urgency here. But Lorenzen's mom kept calling the police over and over and over again, asking for updates and putting pressure on them, and she even contacted the press. She said her son was a former professional basketball star who was 6 foot 11 inches tall, and so it just didn't make any sense that nobody had seen or recognized him over the past few days. And then finally, on July 27th, so 8 days after Lorenzen had gone into the woods, Memphis police took over the case because they had been notified about a 911 call that had been received by a small-town emergency dispatcher early in the morning on July 19th, not that long after Lorenzen had left Shara's house. The 911 dispatcher said the call had been dropped so quickly that they couldn't locate where it was coming from at the time. But Memphis police still didn't understand why nobody had done anything to follow up on that call until over a week after it had been made. Still, there was no use arguing over what could or should have been done, and now Memphis police just wanted to figure out if this 911 call was connected to their missing hometown hero, Lorenzen Wright. And using cell phone tracking data, Memphis police were able to trace the 911 call to Lorenzen's phone number. And they discovered the call had come from somewhere either in or close to the woods, located about 15 miles outside of downtown Memphis. On July 28th, 9 days after Lorenzen had last been seen by anyone, Memphis police officers and police dogs searched the woods and fields in the general location where they believed the 911 call had come from, and what they were looking for were any clues that might lead them to Lorenzen. The sun was blazing overhead, and members of the search party who were looking through an open field near the woods were hot, exhausted, and frustrated that they had not found anything. Then suddenly, one of the police dogs caught a scent. It put its nose to the ground and started off through the field, and the officer, who was the dog's handler, followed close behind. The dog pushed its way through some dried grass, and then came to a stop and started barking. And the dog's handler crouched down to get a better look at whatever the dog had discovered, and when the officer saw what was on the ground, his stomach began to turn. The officer had been at a number of crime scenes, but nothing in his past had prepared him for what he was looking at on the ground right in front of him. He was sure it was a human body, and from the looks of it, there could be bullet wounds on it. But the summer heat and the natural elements had withered the body down to almost nothing. So it was basically just bones and only a little bit of weathered skin, which made it impossible to tell who this person was. The officer stepped back from the body and took a deep breath. Then he called out to the others on the scene, and they quickly joined him and his dog. And then the officer called into the station to say the search party believed they had discovered a murder scene. Not long after that call, forensics and ballistics experts swarmed the area and combed the scene for evidence. And by the end of the day, they had located multiple shell casings from a 9mm pistol not far from the body. However, they couldn't find a gun. And later, the body was finally removed from the field and taken to the coroner. And during the autopsy, the body only weighed about 55 pounds. But dental records confirmed that the victim was the 6'11", 225-pound former professional basketball player, Lorenzen Wright. The news of Lorenzen's death sent the city of Memphis into shock, and some of his former NBA teammates, community leaders, and closest friends like Phil Dotson went on TV to express how upset they were. And all of them talked about how good of a person Lorenzen had been and how much of a loss this really was. But nobody was as heartbroken as Lorenzen's mother. She went on the local news to talk about how amazing her son was and to beg anyone who had information about what had happened to Lorenzen to come forward and share it with police. And so it quickly became clear to Memphis Police Director Tony Armstrong that his department was dealing with one of its most high-profile cases in years. And so Armstrong decided to get directly involved in the investigation because he wanted to make sure everything was done by the book. But Armstrong also wanted to be involved because he had really liked Lorenzen. Over the years, Lorenzen had been a part of so many community programs and charity fundraisers in Memphis that Armstrong had seen him speak on multiple occasions. And Armstrong thought Lorenzen had been a great role model for young people and that he demonstrated how someone should use their money and fame to better the lives of those around them. And so Armstrong wanted to close the case as quickly as possible so he would be able to tell the people of Memphis that police had found justice for one of their city's heroes. But Armstrong felt like his investigative team was already starting at a disadvantage, because the fact that Lorenzen's 911 call had gone unreported for over a week meant that vital evidence at the scene could have been wiped away by the elements, and the killer had been given ample time to travel anywhere in the world before the body was even discovered. But regardless of all that, Armstrong and his lead detectives first had to try to figure out why a former NBA star, who was worth millions of dollars, had gone into the woods in the middle of the night. And so, on August 1st, 4 days after Lorenzen's body had been found, Armstrong and members of his team headed to Shara's house in the suburbs. And after investigators did a thorough search of the house, Armstrong asked if Shara would mind answering some questions to see if she could help police piece together what had happened on the night Lorenzen had left her house and didn't come back. Shara said she would answer anything she could, so she led Armstrong and a detective into the dining room, and they all sat down at the table, and then Armstrong asked her what she remembered about the night Lorenzen disappeared. Shara looked around the room, and then in a quiet voice, she said she didn't want any of the children to hear what she was about to say. Armstrong glanced over at the other detective, and both men nodded and then leaned in close to listen to Shara. And when she started talking, Armstrong's eyes got wide, and he looked like he was in shock. Shara said in a whisper that a little before midnight on July 18th, Lorenzen had gotten a phone call, and he had started pacing around her bedroom, and he was excited and talking loudly to the person on the other line, and she heard him say something about making $110,000 really fast. And at first, Shara had no idea what he was talking about. But then Lorenzen had hung up the phone and walked over to the bags he'd brought with him to the house, and Shara had watched as Lorenzen reached into one of the bags and pulled out a stash of drugs and a wad of cash. She had asked him what was going on, but Lorenzen just said he had some work he needed to take care of. And then he had put the drugs in a box, pocketed the cash, walked out of the room, and headed downstairs. And not long after that, Shara had heard a car driving away from the house. At the dining room table, Armstrong and the detective sat there with stunned looks still on their faces, because Shara's story just made no sense to them. Armstrong knew that Lorenzen had made close to $55 million during his basketball career, and he owned multiple properties in different cities. And Armstrong couldn't understand why a man with that kind of wealth would have anything to do with dealing drugs, or why he would need to make some fast money. And so Armstrong asked Shara if she was really sure about what she had heard and seen that night, and Shara just nodded and said, "Yes, I'm sure." Then Shara looked around again to make sure none of her kids were close by, and in barely above a whisper, she told them that she felt terrible for what she was about to say, and she hoped it would not ruin their image of Lorenzen. But Armstrong said if she had important information, they needed to hear it no matter what it was. So Shara looked Armstrong in the eye and told him that Lorenzen had blown almost all of the money he'd made from playing in the NBA. She said he'd used a lot of it to help friends and family because he was a good man who could never say no to people who asked him for help. But she said he'd also had trouble controlling his own spending, especially when it came to buying luxury cars and properties. And then she said at least one of Lorenzen's houses was going into foreclosure because he couldn't make the mortgage payments. And so, recently, Lorenzen had begun selling drugs to make ends meet. Armstrong thanked Shara for talking to them and said police would be in touch with her if they needed anything else. Then Armstrong and the other detective headed out of the house, got in their cars, and drove back to the station. And when he got there, Armstrong could not help but feel like this case had already taken a turn he did not see coming. At the police station, Armstrong met with the investigators who had searched Shara's house, and they told him that they had not found anything of interest there. So Armstrong stepped into his office and sat down at his desk. He still couldn't get over what Shara had told him. Her story just did not reflect who Armstrong thought Lorenzen was, a young man who went out of his way to give back to the community whenever he could. But Armstrong knew that the fame and fortune of professional athletes was a world he could never fully understand. And so he put his personal feelings aside, and over the next couple of days, he and his team started looking into any connections Lorenzen might have had to known drug dealers in the area, and what Armstrong discovered shocked him all over again. It turned out that in 2009, a year before Lorenzen's body was found in the woods, he had been mentioned in an FBI investigation involving an international drug smuggling ring that had been operating out of Memphis. Armstrong learned that Lorenzen had never been charged with any crimes based on that investigation, but that investigation showed there was a possibility that Lorenzen had ties to one of the largest cocaine dealers in Memphis. And so all of a sudden, Shara's story started to make a lot of sense. And Armstrong also discovered that one of Lorenzen's homes was indeed going into foreclosure, just like Shara had said. And so now Armstrong believed that the chance to make a lot of money from a drug deal could definitely explain what Lorenzen had been doing in the woods the night he died. So the Memphis police decided to focus in on this new potential lead and to track down the big-time cocaine dealer who Lorenzen had possibly known. On August 4th, 2010, a week after Lorenzen's body was discovered, Armstrong and his team were still following leads that might connect Lorenzen to a large-scale drug operation in Memphis. But while the police were at work, hundreds of Lorenzen's fans, teammates, friends, and family gathered at the arena where the Memphis Grizzlies play basketball for Lorenzen's memorial service. Shara, the children, and Lorenzen's parents led a long procession across the arena floor to Lorenzen's closed silver casket. Each of Lorenzen's children wore a cap with a logo on it from one of the NBA teams Lorenzen had played for, and they all took a moment to say their last goodbyes to their dad. The memorial service was a chance for Memphis to celebrate and honor one of their most loved sports figures, and the service was even televised on local channels for people who could not attend in person. And during the memorial, Lorenzen's mom was visibly shaken and too upset to speak at times. So Lorenzen's younger brother did most of the talking for the family. And he told the crowd how much they all had loved Lorenzen and how proud they were of everything he had accomplished. And then, as he fought back tears, he said he'd always thought his big brother was invincible, so he couldn't believe Lorenzen was now gone. Not long after Lorenzen's brother finished speaking, the mayor of Memphis stepped up to the mic, and he promised Lorenzen's family and everyone in the arena that authorities would track down whoever had killed Lorenzen, and they would bring that person to justice. And in the days following that memorial service, Police Director Armstrong felt the pressure building on his investigative team. Lorenzen's murder was now national news, and local news ran stories on Lorenzen and asked for updates on the investigation constantly. And in addition to that, the mayor had just made a public claim that the killer would soon be brought to justice. But all of the added pressure did not mean Memphis police would get any closer to solving the case, and Armstrong's team could only follow the leads they had. So, based on what Shara had told them, and on information from the past FBI investigation, Memphis police continued to aggressively pursue any leads that could tie Lorenzen to the drug trade in Memphis. But they quickly discovered that the cocaine dealer Lorenzen possibly had links to had been in prison at the time of Lorenzen's murder, and police couldn't find any evidence connecting Lorenzen to any other known drug dealers in the area. And so this drug deal theory that police hoped would lead them right to Lorenzen's killer ended up leading them nowhere. And now Armstrong found himself back at square one. And so Armstrong sent his investigators back out to the crime scene to look for more evidence, but throughout all those new searches, they didn't find anything new. All they had were the shell casings that had been found when the body had been found, and that was it. So, without anything to go on, Armstrong just re-interviewed Lorenzen's friend Phil, Lorenzen's ex-wife Shara, and all of Lorenzen's closest family members and friends, but they didn't find anything new in those conversations either. And so, even as pressure continued to mount on the police from the public, the victim's friends and family, and Memphis politicians, Lorenzen's murder case started to go cold, and it stayed that way for years. In the summer of 2012, 2 years after Lorenzen's body was found, his mother decided to go on a public crusade to find justice for her son. Over time, she had watched Lorenzen's story fade from the news, and she had seen the investigation into his murder almost completely stall out, and there was no way she was going to stand for that. And so she started reaching out to local and national press and talking to anybody in the media who would listen. And she told them that she wouldn't just let Lorenzen's memory be forgotten, and she demanded that the police do their job and find Lorenzen's killer. And she said as long as she had blood running through her veins, she was going to keep fighting until her son could finally rest in peace. Now, Director Armstrong saw all of this happening, and he knew that Lorenzen's mom and others in the Memphis community were angry at him and the police for not being able to solve this case. And so Armstrong tried to jumpstart the investigation by assigning a series of new lead detectives to the case. But unfortunately, none of them made any headway. And as more time went by with no new leads and seemingly no hope, Lorenzen's mom started to feel like nobody cared about this case anymore. But then, after years of the investigation barely moving forward, Memphis police would finally catch a break that seemed to come completely out of nowhere. Fast forward to January of 2015, almost 5 years after Lorenzen's murder. Lorenzen's mom continued her media crusade, but she felt like she was the only one who was still fighting for her son. But on a cold winter afternoon, Armstrong was sitting in his office when one of his detectives walked in. This detective had an excited look on his face, and he started talking really fast. And Armstrong looked up and said, wait, what's going on here? What's going on? And the detective slowed down and then just said there was a novel that had just been published that Armstrong had to read. Armstrong stared at the detective like this might be some kind of prank, because he couldn't understand why any new book would warrant this much excitement. But then, the detective told him that even though the book was fiction, he thought it might be connected to the murder of Lorenzen Wright. Armstrong just sat there in silence for a minute. He never imagined he'd have to turn to a work of fiction for possible evidence in a 5-year-long murder investigation. But soon after this meeting, Armstrong and other members of the investigative team read parts of this new book. And what they found didn't provide any hard proof about what had happened to Lorenzen, but it did spark their interest in one particular suspect. And eventually, that newfound interest would help lead to a full-scale relaunch of the investigation, and with more resources behind them, Memphis police would finally uncover who had killed Lorenzen years earlier in the woods. Based on evidence found throughout the investigation, cell phone data, and interviews conducted over the course of 7 years, here is a reconstruction of what authorities believe happened to Lorenzen Wright on the day he died, July 19, 2010. Just after midnight on July 19, 2010, the killer stood behind a tree at the end of a dirt path leading into the woods. The heat and their own nerves were making the killer sweat, so they wiped their hands dry on the side of their black pants. Then they drew a 9mm pistol from their waistband and clutched it tight. Then the killer saw headlights cutting through the darkness, and they heard a car slowly driving towards them. The car parked a few yards away, and the killer saw the driver step outside. Then they watched Lorenzen get out of the car on the passenger side. Even in the darkness, Lorenzen looked huge, and the killer felt a little bit afraid. So the killer took a steadying breath and then huddled a little bit closer to the tree. A moment later, the driver began walking down the path towards the killer, and Lorenzen followed them. So the killer, at this point, squinted in the darkness and stepped out from their hiding place and raised their gun right at Lorenzen. But the killer hesitated. And when Lorenzen saw this person with the gun standing there, Lorenzen immediately grabbed his phone, turned off the path, and started running deep into the woods. The killer fired the gun at Lorenzen, but they missed, so they took off running after Lorenzen. But Lorenzen was so fast, it was almost impossible for the killer to even stay close. But the killer could see the light from Lorenzen's phone, and so they just kept following that light, and they fired another shot generally in the direction of the phone. Then the woods started to clear, and the moonlight and stars made it easier for the killer to see what was ahead of them and to keep Lorenzen in their sight. And then the killer heard Lorenzen shouting into his phone, desperately asking the police for help. And so the killer fired off a few more shots, and Lorenzen stopped talking, but he kept running. The killer could feel a pain in their side, and they were gasping for air by this point, but they kept pushing as hard as they could to try to keep up with Lorenzen. Then the killer saw Lorenzen running towards a high barbed wire fence that separated the woods from a field on the other side. And the killer just watched, dumbfounded, as Lorenzen leapt clear over the fence in stride. But as Lorenzen jumped, he must have caught his back foot on the fence, because when he landed, he fell to the ground and kind of tumbled forward. And the killer knew this was likely their only chance, so they ran as fast as they could towards the fence, and when they saw Lorenzen trying to get back up, they fired multiple shots through the opening in the barbed wire. And the killer heard Lorenzen scream, and they saw him fall to the ground again. Then the killer managed to get over the barbed wire fence to the other side, and once they got there, they saw Lorenzen laying on the ground, bleeding and struggling to breathe. The killer stood there for a moment, watching Lorenzen. Then they took a deep breath, aimed their pistol at Lorenzen's chest and they fired. Then they raised their gun slightly and aimed it at Lorenzen's face, and they fired again. At this point, Lorenzen's body went limp and he died right there in the field. The killer stood over Lorenzen's body and they felt like they wanted to throw up. But they took another deep breath, turned around, made their way back over the barbed wire fence and back into the dark woods. And finally, after what felt like hours, but had only been a few minutes, the killer found their way back to the dirt path and saw that the car was still parked there. Then they heard something behind them, and the driver of the car stepped out of the darkness and approached the killer. The driver asked if it was done, and the killer just nodded and said yes. So the driver smiled, climbed back into their car, and drove back home. And when they got inside their house, the driver went from room to room, checking on all 6 of their sleeping children. Lorenzen's ex-wife, Shara, had not actually pulled the trigger, but she was the one behind Lorenzen's murder. She had hired a deacon at the church where she was a pastor to kill her ex-husband. Because it would turn out that Shara was the one who really had the huge spending problem, and she had decided that the $26,000 a month that Lorenzen paid in alimony and child support was not enough money for her to live on, and she wanted the payout from Lorenzen's $1 million life insurance policy and his sizable pension from the NBA. So Shara had decided Lorenzen needed to die. And it turned out that Lorenzen had been right to believe he had a real chance to repair his marriage with Shara and to move back in with his family in Memphis, because Shara had told him how much she missed him. But that wasn't all she had done. In the days leading up to the murder, she had sent Lorenzen a series of sexually explicit text messages telling him how badly she wanted him back. And she had used those messages to lure Lorenzen from Atlanta back to Memphis. And so, late at night on July 18th, 2010, when Lorenzen was staying with Shara in her bedroom, she told him that she had to go meet someone who owed her money. But she said she didn't really want to go alone because they were meeting outside of the city. And so Lorenzen said he would go with her, and that's how Shara had gotten Lorenzen out to the woods where the gunman was waiting for him. Shara knew that Lorenzen had been mentioned in an investigation concerning a drug smuggling ring, and even though Lorenzen had never been found guilty of any crime in that case, she figured if she told police Lorenzen had been dealing drugs, they would discover the past investigation and come to believe the murder was indeed drug-related. And for years, it looked like Shara was going to get away with it. But then, in 2015, she had decided to become an author, and so she self-published a novel. And Shara barely disguised the fact that she wanted people who read the book to believe it was about her own life. And in the book, the main character is married to a basketball player who was abusive, violent, and a terrible husband. So, when Armstrong and other investigators read the book, they thought it came off like an attack on Lorenzen. And even though nobody is killed in this book, some investigators thought that at times, the book read like Shara was trying to justify Lorenzen's murder. Now, the police were not going to use a work of fiction as proof of Shara's guilt, but her book, and a new round of pressure that came from Lorenzen's friends and family after the book was published, led police to re-examine Shara as a potential suspect. As Lorenzen's ex-wife, she had always been a person of interest in the case, but police never felt like they had any evidence tying her to the crime. But once the investigation was relaunched in full, Memphis police received direct help from the FBI, and both agencies focused their energy on people directly connected to Shara. And in 2017, 7 years after Lorenzen's murder, investigators spoke to a woman who had babysat Shara's children on several occasions, and that woman told investigators that she had once overheard Shara say that she had gotten rid of a gun by throwing it into a lake outside of the city. And so, an FBI dive team searched a lake that fit that description, and they found a 9mm pistol in the water that ended up matching the shell casings that had been found near Lorenzen's body. And that gun led investigators to the man from Shara's church who had pulled the trigger. And eventually, that man led them directly to Shara and exposed her involvement in her ex-husband's murder. The man who actually killed Lorenzen was convicted of murder and sentenced to life in prison plus 41 years. Shara signed a plea deal, and as part of that deal, she was convicted of facilitation of first-degree murder and was only sentenced to 30 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 7 years. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen podcast. If you enjoyed today's story, be sure to check out our YouTube channel, just called MrBallen, where we have hundreds more stories just like this one, but many of them are not available on this podcast. They are only on YouTube. Again, the channel is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.